Got it. Welcome, Hearthstone fans, to our #1 source for Boomer News Online. That's right, it's our 7th weekly classic Hearthstone deck spotlight. As always, I'm your host, Methuselah. Our guest tonight is a true community legend. She's been the rank 1 player in North America. She's a tournament veteran of both NA and EU, as well as the recent 3rd place finisher in our 6th monthly NA tournament. So, welcome, Amber. It's good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So I always like to start off with a couple of personal questions, let the viewers get to know you a little bit better. So first of all, how long have you played Hearthstone for?
I've actually been playing Hearthstone since 2014, which, if I'm doing the math correctly, means I was 12 years old at the time, which is pretty scary to think about.
So this has
I
been
basically played.
like part of your adolescence or part of your like growing up stories, deeply
Yeah,
involved in Hearthstone.
I played every single expansion since 2014.
Mhm.
So basically, I've been playing the game for like 8 years at this point. So my entire life, I guess.
That's really cool. It's an interesting perspective, especially for some of us older players who may have picked it up when we already had jobs and other things going on. But it's interesting that you got to grow up with it. I'm sure you made a lot of friends along the way too.
For sure.
Cool. So when we talk about the classic format, it's a little different than standard and wild. What is it that got you interested in classic in the first place?
Well, I think partly the nostalgia of playing like Hearthstone when I was younger, and I really like how it's an unchanging format, right? There's no updates or sets, so you got to be really creative to find new things, right? And there's also like less bullshit mechanics. Like I don't need to play around every single possible card that you might discover. So
Yeah,
that's always good.
yeah. You kind of play the deck that you've got in Hearthstone, right? And I think one of the cool things about not being able to discover cards, although the discover mechanic is interesting in its own way. One of the things about it is, like you say, your deck is going to be full of imperfections in some ways. You're never going to have a deck that truly answers everything because you don't have a way to discover something that silences a minion out of nowhere when you play a class that has no silence in it. Uh,
Yeah, for sure. Some like the newer formats, right, or in the standard or current standard format, it just feels that like you always have an answer to everything that your opponent could possibly do.
Yeah, definitely not the case in Classic, where I think we experience kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, where you get really frustrated sometimes because we just don't have an answer to certain things, like Concealed Gadget Sand is a classic one, or certain just minions. If you're playing a warrior deck, you're gonna have trouble facing Savannah Highbane no matter what. There just aren't tools in the deck that adequately deal with certain things. So
Yeah, I was
it's
playing
go ahead.
I was playing a Shaman against Control Paladin the other day, and one of the hard choices was deciding whether I wanted to save my Hex for Tyrion, which I knew was going to come later, because that way I could get rid of the Death Rattle.
Yeah, there's a lot of like playing around what your opponent is going to play in the future. So imagining future turns, looking at your board right now, developing a plan with the cards that you have in your hand to kind of feel out where am I going to be in a few turns and what's going to happen if the worst case scenario comes down where Tyrion is there on turn 8. Do I have an answer to that? And if I don't, will I be able to win the game? Asking questions like those is something that classic players do a lot, and I think it's healthy because it builds, vision. It builds our ability to look forward in turns. But it also doesn't allow us to rely on crutches, like I'll just discover something with nature studies, the turn before Tyrion or the turn that Tyrion arrives and have a 2-mana answer to him or something.
Mm-hmm.
So, Amber, you're deeply, deeply involved in the classic community in so many ways. And for our viewers out there who haven't had the pleasure of meeting Amber, I'd like to share a few things about the volunteer work that she does with us. And this list is by no means extensive. She does a lot of things around here. But a couple of the things I just wanted to highlight. So Amber helps us process and post videos exactly like this one on our YouTube channel. So all of the things in the description, all of the work that goes into those. She's primarily responsible for that. She's also a moderator of our community on Discord, where she helps resolve questions and tickets. You may have had your own questions that have been answered by Amber. She'll be able to put you in the right place. That includes tickets that we have during tournaments. We have play play issues come up, somebody disconnects or somebody doesn't check in, whatever it is. And she helps handle some of those as well, so it takes the pressure off our casting team. She's also by far the #1 contributor to our Discord server as far as messages sent. So she helps to welcome new players, assist community members in finding resources. And she's just generally being a good, positive, friendly force in the community scene. You're also helping us pilot a new blog for Classic players. That's yet to drop, but we've got a website. We've got some material that we've thought up, and that should be here shortly. So she's helping us contribute to that as well. So Amber, first of all, thank you so much for all the wonderful work you do for the community. I wanted to ask you, what is it that motivates you to be such a powerful, positive force for the Classic community?
I mean, that's really high praise. So thank you for that. I just think it's like important to help others, right? Really feel like you can make a difference in a positive manner. That's sort of always something that I'm looking to do, especially since, when I was new, when I first started playing Classic, a lot of my success is tied to those who helped me out when I was starting. So I definitely want to pay that forwards and make sure that other people have the same experience that I did.
I'm sure you grew up partly watching Hearthstone videos too, right? You'd watch casts or you'd watch, things similar to the program that we have today.
I mean, actually, not really. I didn't figure out how to net deck for many years, and I was struggling to hit that rank 20 card back, despite not being able to lose stars.
Well, maybe it would have been helpful if the resources like these were maybe a little bit more accessible back then.
Yeah, for sure.
I have to say, when I was growing up, so to speak, in Hearthstone, I certainly was really interested in watching informative videos on Hearthstone. Things that I could, sort of learn from, get some expert advice on how to do things, not feel like I was completely lost or having to kind of reinvent the wheel. So really, one of those aspects of service where we try and bring back to the community what was brought to us and kind of carry on that tradition, maybe make it a little better in some cases too.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit about the deck that we're going to be going over today. So we're going to be talking about Zoolock today. And just a few words on this deck to begin. Zoolock is perhaps the most stable archetype from the very early days of Hearthstone to today. And Zoolock is a really commonly misunderstood deck. So I want to kind of address some of these misconceptions that we might have. There's one pervasive misconception that Zoolock is so simple that a bot can play it, which doesn't really paint an accurate picture for us. So first of all, I'd like to explain why this deck is the go-to choice for botters, and that's because it's consistent enough to not have too many bad draws or bad matchups. It's cheap, the games are short, and there's a lot of additional programming that needs to happen for a bot to understand sophisticated concepts like ramp or mana cheat. You might have played single-player Hearthstone, and you've seen a boss that you're facing just play prep and pass, do nothing else with that prep, right? So bots can sometimes have trouble with certain types of cards. So Zoolock being such a creature-heavy deck, a program can be written with relative ease to make a reasonable bot. And keep in mind that the purpose of a bot is not to be the absolute best, right? So it's easy to make a reasonable enough bot that farms XP, does whatever else. But just because a deck can be played with a reasonable enough level of competency by a bot, that does not mean that the deck has a low skill cap, or that an experienced human pilot will choose to play the same lines that a bot would. A good example of this is playing around our opponent's removal, which is an essential trait that any successful Hearthstone player should have. It can be really simple for us to bait a bot into playing into a massive AoE clear, like Arcanine Circle or Explosive, Consecration, whatever else. But skilled humans will pick the right moment to play a life tap if they detect that maybe some removal is coming, or play a sticky minion that would dodge AoE removal, something like Harvest Golem or Argent Squire. And also just knowing the exact numbers. If you're going into turn 4 against a paladin, you may be expecting that they play True Silver. So maybe you buff your Voidwalker up to have 5 HP from Young Priestess and Defender of Argus. So, if you showed up today expecting that this deck spotlight wouldn't teach you anything because you think you have a preconception that the Zoo archetype is a brain dead deck that's so simple a robot can play it, I encourage you to be enlightened by what Amber is going to discuss today with this deck list. So, Amber, what got you interested in playing this deck in the first place?
The one thing that I always like to say is that what some people I hear, right, they're so excited to play Miracle Rogue in Classic, right? Or like, oh, if Classic came out, I finally get to play that handlock deck that plays all the 8/8s on turn 4 and 5. But a little bit surprising to some. But when I was coming over to Classic, I thought, I'm so excited to play Zoo Warlock and play all my little 1/1 creatures and buff them all up, and then win the game, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, everybody, has their own Hearthstone style, and it's reflected in the decks that they play. Some players are naturally more gifted at playing a reactionary style, playing more control-y decks, and some players just have a natural gift for building a board properly, calculating how much damage they need to set up two-turn lethal, playing around opponents' threats, things like that. And you play a lot of creature-based decks, so it sounds like this was a really natural fit for you. So,
Yeah, for sure.
so what is
I don't know.
I guess you play a lot of different kinds of decks. You're a very versatile player. You know many, many, many archetypes. So what is Zoolock's role in kind of the current ladder meta at this moment? What do you think?
I mean, Zoolock is the gatekeeper deck because there's so many bots that play it. It kind of shoves out like Druid and Shaman out of the meta because they don't want to play into the Zoo matchup, and they know that there will always be Zoo players online because of the bots. So I mean, so Zoo is really strong as well. Like not just bots play it, right? I think a good human can do really well with Zoo as well, and we see that in tournaments, right? Because the Zoo sort of fits into this anti-druid package that you can run um, with Miracle Rogue, Shaman, Zoo, and you sort of target the druid in that. And the reason why that works so well is because Zoo has such a strong spread of matchups across the board, where it does really well into a lot of these board-based aggro decks, and then also beats some of these mid-rangey shamans and the druids. And then its consistency too, right? You almost will never have a bad hand with Zoo. So it's just so strong, so consistent. I think it sort of gets a bad rap because of all the bots. It's sort of frustrating to play against a non-human opponent and then lose to it. But just how strong the deck is, it just sort of pushes other stuff out and sort of controls the metagame in a way.
Is there any worry when you're playing on the ladder that because of the prevalence of Zoobots, that many players will be playing lists that target this particular deck, and that you face a lot of maybe counter matchups pretty frequently?
Um, yeah, that's a good point. I like to think of it like a lot of the people that are teching anti-druid are are teching sort of not druid, sorry, teching anti-zoo, are teching sort of anti-zoo bots, right? Where they'll play their explosive trap because I have a bunch of 2 HP minions. But a bot would normally run into that and just lose their whole board. But maybe I held Defender of Argus since turn 1 in my opening hand, and I was waiting for the explosive trap to buff my minions up to 3 and then get through your explosive trap. So I think a lot of people tech anti-Zoo, but they sort of only play that one level of target against Zoo, and they're not sort of ready for someone to actually play Zoo with some thought to it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's certainly something that I've noticed is that good Zoo players will know when to buff minions, when to tap, and when to flood. And a bot doesn't know that. It doesn't have the game sense to know, oh, my opponent's playing Druid, therefore the Druid's AoE removal is swipe, and I will play around swipe. Right? A human being can do that fairly simply, where they just don't put a bunch of 1 HP minions on the board. And similarly with Explosive Trap, like you're saying, playing cards that have 2 HP and just holding Defender of Argus in hand. Or, if you don't have any buff, any way to get your minions above 2 HP, just life tapping. right? Because if you control the board, maybe with 3 minions at a time, it's not really that necessary to continue putting minions on the board. Whereas a bot will just see, put more stuff, right? And they usually, it's usually very counterproductive for them. So let's just start taking a look at some of these cards. Today we're going to do something a little bit different than we normally do. We're going to present one main zoo list that you can use that's a universal good list. And we're also going to have a couple of variations that we explore today too, that depending on your pocket meta that you're playing on the ladder, you may choose to switch out a couple of cards, you may choose to pick a slightly different approach. So let's start with the most conventional list first. I'll bring it up here. You can help me out. What are we putting in here first?
Well, so I know you like to build it card by card, but I do think that the most important aspect is actually selecting the Warlock class.
Yeah, explain that to us.
The reason why you want to select Warlock is Warlock has a couple key minions that will be important to Zoo, but also its hero power, Life Tap, is probably the strongest hero power in the game. And that allows you to draw a card at the cost of 2 mana and 2 life.
Mm-hmm. And how are we going to use that with our deck?
Yeah, so Zoo runs a lot of cheap minions, and this lets us constantly have our hand with options where sort of eventually where normal decks will run out of cards, Zoo will always be having 2 cards a turn when every other deck is relying on that 1 card from the top of their deck. And so Zoo can sort of keep the pressure up the entirety of the game and constantly have pressure on the board where, I mean, some decks just can't deal with that and will just lose.
What about this downside of taking 2 damage? Are we concerned with this deck that we're life tapping and bringing ourselves lower and lower?
Yeah, there is a slight concern of that because a lot of the ways that sort of these aggro decks will beat Zoo is they'll hold back some key charge minions or burn damage they have from their hand, and at that last second, the Zoo taps into range, and then they play it all down and just kill the Zoo. So there is some concern to that. But because of Zoo's sort of control on the board, a lot of decks won't really threaten lethal. So you're generally fine to life tap quite a few times in a game.
Yeah, absolutely. Once we control the board, a lot of times in Classic, the board is the primary source of damage for most decks. There are decks that play, very high burst combos with things like Leroy Shadow Step, Cold Blood, of course. But just in general, a lot of the damage is done on the board. So if we're constantly controlling the board, if we're almost always putting more and more and more creatures on there, and our game plan is to win the board, we're rarely going to take face damage from our opponent. We won't find too many race situations where us tapping is going to really impact the game, the outcome of the game as far as our life total is concerned. Alright, so we've got a good hero power. We can play 2 cards per turn while our opponent can only play 1. What are those cards that we put in here?
So let's start with some. So Warlock and Zoolock sort of has an interesting compared to other decks where it doesn't run a lot of class cards. It runs a lot of neutral minions, but the class cards that it does run are really strong, and those would be 2 Flame Imps, 2 Doomguard, and 2 Soulfire. Oh, and 2 Voidwalker too.
Right.
The weakest one of the.
So let's take a look at some of these. I want to compare cards. We've got Voidwalker here, that's our class specific. It's a 1/3 with taunt. If I go to a neutral minion and I look at Goldshire Footman, that's a 1/2 with taunt, right? So just categorically worse card. If I were playing any other class, and I wanted a taunt for 1 mana, I'd have to put this one in. If we look at Flame Imp here, 3/2 for 1 mana, and we look through the collection, there are no 1-cost cards that have stats that are close to that. The closest thing we get is 2 mana. So already we have Flame Imp, a card that's overstated for a 1-cost minion above anything else, period, in the format. And we've got Voidwalker, which there's a vanilla version that is just, again, categorically worse. So already these cards are very strong as far as the value for the stats that we get out of them.
Right. And sort of that sort of plays into what Zoo's trying to do, where Zoo wins by sort of taking control of the board, and it does that by sort of cheating the early game by using these, somewhat overpowered early game minions and comboing them with other minions that will buff them up, like Abusive and Direwolf and Priestess. And even in a sense, the knife juggler helps you trade really efficiently and sort of take control of the board, and you sort of never let it up for the rest of the game.
Now there are some downsides to these cards as well. So I'm looking at Flame Imp here. We deal 3 damage to our hero. Or how often are we concerned about this?
I mean, typically you're playing Flame Imp fairly early on in the game, the first couple turns, and at that point, 3 damage when you have like 25 to 30 HP, that doesn't really mean anything. So, I mean, it will matter later sometimes, but typically, I mean, Flame Imp taking 3 damage, I don't even think twice. I just play it.
Sounds good. There are a couple other cards in here that have downsides as well. Let's take a look at Soulfire first. So Soulfire costs 0 mana, which allows us to make it a tempo play, just like something like Prep Eviscerate. So 0 mana, and we don't need an activator for it, but it does discard a card. Walk me through that. How do we deal with this discard?
Right. So by using a bunch of Zoo, when we create the list, they'll have a lot of cheaper minions, and we'll just be playing all of our minions, and our hand will be like empty some of the times even. And so when you're playing Soulfire with an empty hand, then you just don't discard anything, and then it's just 0 mana, 4 damage straight up, and that's really strong. And typically, sometimes maybe I discard like a random 1-drop, and I'm like, oh, that's fine. I don't really care about some of the minions. It's not like the only worry is if I play that and I lose Doomguard or another Soulfire or maybe even Defender. Those are the only cards that I'm sort of worried about losing from the Soulfire. But everything else is either expendable or my hand's going to be empty. And then I don't mind the Soulfire. The downside really doesn't matter too much.
So one thing that I'm hearing here is that although we have this Warlock hero power where we can tap and get 2 cards per turn, it can be a little bit risky because we can end up with, for example, what you're talking about, 2 Soulfires or Soulfire and Doomguard, where we run the risk of maybe discarding one of the cards that we didn't want to discard, that we can't just dump our hand and then play Soulfire or Doomguard last.
Right, yeah. Sometimes you'll get those hands where you have 2 Doomguards in your hand, and there's just almost no way to not discard the other Doomguard. And that's like, you're discarding part of your win con, right? And that feels really bad, but...
Right.
I mean, so you do run the risk of that.
What do we, just out of curiosity, when you find yourself in a situation where maybe turn 5 or 6, and I know this is, very situational, but if you have 2 Doomguards in hand, is there ever a situation where you're starting to tap, try and accumulate some more worthless cards and play out both of the Doomguards, reduce the risk of discarding it, or is that not really something we do?
So on turn like 5 or 6, I mean, I would just never do that, because I feel like the part of what makes people so frustrated to play against Zoo is seeing that Doomguard come down on turn 5. And even if it discards another Doomguard, you're still frustrated that Doomguard came down. So I'm not going to sort of waste time to tap and sort of, better my odds. I just want to play down on 5.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think that there's a good lesson to be learned there, maybe in the general Hearthstone context, that we don't always have to get 100% perfect value out of every single card that we play in a game. In fact, a lot of times when you watch the really top-level players, they'll try to get value out of everything, but they also choose moments where they have to be eminently practical and just say, I know it's a good card, I know that it can, combo, I know I could play Doomguard without discarding anything. But it's more important to pay attention to the state of the game and what our win condition is than it is to worry too much about value. And I think this is a good example of that, is everybody's afraid of seeing Doomguard on 5. It's rare that somebody has a perfect answer to it, and because they've usually been behind trying to clear minions off the board, and then a 5/7 comes down. And it's a totally different suite of removal required for this card. The kind of removal like Hex that wouldn't be kept in a starting hand against Zoo normally.
Yeah, so something I noticed when watching Handlock, which is a different Warlock deck, but some people get a little attached to like those mountain giants in their hand, or just their hand size in general, and they don't want to play the Soulfire because they don't want to discard a key card. In Zoo, all your cards are like sort of worthless, so I'm never attached to any of, like, I'm not attached to Leper Gnome, so you don't run the risk of any of that.
Right, definitely. Deploying these cards at the proper time is important. sometimes early on in the game, we want to play Soulfire to like just tempo kill a minion so that we can get out of the way. And it doesn't always have to get perfect value, right? We're not always going to hit Misha with Soulfire. There are some times that it's even effective against less maybe stat-intensive minions, something like Knife Juggler or things like that. So what's the primary purpose of Soulfire in the early game?
So in the early game, right, you're really trying to control the board, and Soulfire is a card that costs 0 mana, so you can play all the minions that you normally would play, and then you also get to kill one of your opponent's minions, because typically they won't have anything like at 4 HP in the early game.
Yeah.
Usually even not even 3 HP. So this just lets you continue your development, but also just kill off one of your opponent's minions, and that sort of tempo play is like most decks can't match that. So
Yeah, and not there aren't too many decks that control the board purely with spells. A lot of times, most decks in Classic are playing at least a few minions that they hope will get trades on the board. When you're able to take an early turn and play 3 mana worth of minions and also play Soulfire to remove one of their own, it dramatically limits the number of options that they have to remove your board. Their AoE clear might be something like Consecration, which requires 4 mana. And if they don't have a, Harvest Golem or something early to contest your board a little bit and try and chip away, make 2-for-1 trades, then Soulfire becomes a much more powerful card because you're just able to build your board the way that you want it without any interference from your opponent.
exactly.
Help me out. So what are a couple other cards that we put in here? You mentioned some of these neutral minions that we were going to put in. Which ones are we going to do?
So there's a sort of like the suite of cards that's played in every aggro deck, and that is Argent Squire, Abusive Sergeant, and Knife Juggler.
So,
and Leper Gnome too.
Okay, yeah.
These are the suite that fits into like every aggro deck.
And why these cards in particular?
Right. So what these cards let you do, and the common theme around Zoo is creating a sticky board and trading favorably. Now, all of these cards that you'll see in this list either are sticky or trade favorably, except for the exception of Leper Gnome, which we can get to later. Mm-hmm. So Argent Squire has that Divine Shield, makes it really hard to trade into. You put that down on 1, and they need to bump it with 2 minions or hit it with 2 instances of damage to kill it. And that's just not going to happen early on into the game. Right. And then Knife Juggler, I have so many 1-drop minions. Knife Juggler will be poking things with damage and usually even just killing these early minions. So this really helps me control the board. Mm-hmm. And then Abusive Sergeant with the +2 attack. I'm giving that to my Voidwalker. I'm giving that to my Argent Squire, and I'm just controlling the board, and I'm trading upwards with that, so I'm getting more value out of sort of my lower costed minions.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, one of the, when we talk about Zoo, we'll talk about the matchups in a little bit, but I think a lot of people already know that Zoo tends to be strong against Druid. And at first glance, you might think, well, Druid has all these big taunt minions. How can a wimpy creature deck be good against that? And Abusive Sergeant is one of the reasons, right? Because it allows us to take minions like Argent Squire, which is just a measly 1/1, and bump it up to a 3/1 for a turn. Or add even more buffs on it, and all of a sudden we're developing creatures on the board like Abusive Sergeant and allowing ourselves to trade up for free, essentially with a Divine Shield, into some of those bigger taunt minions. So these buffs are really important. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the common ones that will happen in Zoo versus Druid is if sometimes the Druid will cheat out that big 4/6 taunt, but you have a Knife Juggler on the board and you buff it with Abusive. The Knife Juggler hits the 4/6 taunt, and then you can trade in the Knife Juggler for a clean kill on a 5-mana creature for only spending your 2-mana Knife Juggler, which was already on the board, and just 1 mana on the current turn to summon the Abusive.
And and you get the 2/1 body from the Abusive after that anyway, so it feels even better. Yeah. I like all these cards. These cards seem to go in every single one of my decks somehow.
Exactly.
Absolutely aggro tools. In fact, we even see some control decks that will get so desperate by with facing Zoo that they have trouble removing the Zoo board, and they'll even tech in Argent Squire. So I would say this card in particular, one of the most universally beloved cards in Classic, does kind of fit in a lot of different archetypes.
Yeah, I think it's like the strongest card in Classic, Argent Squire.
Yeah, I would be I would definitely put it on my short list, maybe top three, top five. It's hard to think of a card that really does more than Argent Squire in a lot of games. So okay, what else are we putting in here? We've got a couple of cheap minions. I guess we haven't talked too much about Leper Gnome yet. Fill me in. What exactly is it about Leper Gnome that we want in this deck?
Right. So I know some lists that cut the Leper Gnome, but I wouldn't really do that because it does provide a lot of value.
Mhm.
But when I say that Zoo wants to create sticky boards that trade favorably, that doesn't really seem obvious with the Leper Gnome because Leper Gnome's not a sticky minion. It's got 1 HP, but it also doesn't really trade favorably. It doesn't have a bonus damage sort of snuck in there.
And we're back. So sorry about that, everybody. That was my fault. I lost power there for just a moment. But hopefully we're back online and it won't happen again. So let's pick up where we left off. We were talking about a little bit about Leper Gnome. Run me through this card again. You were saying it's not necessarily the highest statted minion, and it's not necessarily that helps us accomplish the same things that maybe Flame Imp or Voidwalker would, but it does have this nifty death rattle, right?
Yeah. So despite this not being like a sticky minion or something that trades favorably, it does do 2 damage to the face, which is useful in Zoo because when you look at the deck list, it doesn't have a lot of burn and a lot of ways to hit face directly. And sometimes that really struggles where when you get to that late game and you just need every little bit of damage on the opponent's face. And that 2 damage the Leper Gnome gave at the beginning of the game might actually be the difference between you winning and you losing. It also
Absolutely.
does have the 2/1 body, which lets it trade upwards into most 2-mana minions. So there is some value to be got from the Leper Gnome, but generally it's just like a 1-mana minion that you sort of need to fill out those 1-mana creatures.
Yeah, there are a couple of other buffs that we can add to this that are notable, I think. Number one is when we're playing against a warrior, particularly a warrior bot. We assume that they may play Armor Smith on turn 2, or they may coin it out. If we have a Leper Gnome on the board, we can play Abusive, and we have 4 damage to trade into that. So, as a proactive 1-drop, the importance of Leper Gnome is partly this 2 attack. If we imagine that same situation where we have Argent Squire or Flame Imp on the board, and they play their Armor Smith, well, number one, Argent Squire can't trade into Armor Smith. It'll be 3 damage with an Abusive. And number two, we may not want to use that on our Flame Imp. It's possible to use Flame Imp to trade up, but we're wasting 1 damage, and we kind of do want to be efficient with the damage sources we have in this deck. As the game goes longer and longer, like you say, every single little point of damage matters. So, Leper Gnome, it does kind of fill this spot where 2 attack is nice to have on the first turn. There are just certain things that we want it to trade into. And also, we just don't really mind if it dies, right? Get the death rattle off of it. Yeah. There's also another interaction here that I wanted to talk about just briefly. So let me pull up Elven Archer here. So we play 2 copies of this, right?
You do. I don't think you do.
Play 1 copy? Oh, you don't
play
play
0
you play
copies.
0 copies in yours. But
Yeah.
so
There is variations that run the Elven Archer. And there's also variations that run the coil. But I prefer the versions that run Elven Archer because, I mean, I don't think the draw is too important, but that 1 damage helps clear out some of these minions, right? It helps you trade favorably. And it also leaves a 1/1 body on the board, which, I mean, just having any minions on the board is very valuable to Zoo.
right. It's a card that we see sometimes in Zubot lists when they can figure out where to target with the archer. But there is also this interaction if for those at home, if you do choose to put Elven Archer in your deck later in the game, you can play Leper Gnome. You can attack face with it if you get a chance. It's going to do 2 damage whether your opponent clears it or not. But one thing we can do is we can hit face with it and then archer it down. Use our own archer for a total of 4 damage in 1 turn from this Leper Gnome. So later on in the game, don't forget you have the ability to activate your own if you do choose to play Elven Archer. All right, what other minions can we throw in here?
I think the next most important minion is Harvest Golem.
Why Harvest Golem?
So Harvest Golem is an amazing card, and it fits in a ton of decks. Right, you see this card quite a bit, and it's 3 mana, 2/3, but it summons a 2/1 damaged golem. So when you add all those stats up, this is a 4/4 for 3 mana, which is really strong. That's a lot of stats. But also the delayed aspect of the 2/1 makes it really hard to kill off this minion. Because if you kill it off, then there's another minion that comes out of it. And then the 3 HP is hard as a breakpoint to hit for some decks. And there you get this great minion that can go 2 for 1, 3 for 1 against those aggro decks, and then also is really hard to clear for decks looking to control the zoo.
Yeah, one thing I want to point out about this card, and we were kind of talking about this a little bit earlier, was, there's the difference between how a human pilots this deck and how a machine pilots this deck. A human, when we sense that there's some AoE board clear coming down, maybe, Frost Nova Doomsayer, Harvest Golem is usually a really good choice, because now it just creates an extra thing that our opponent has to deal with. Instead of doing exactly what they want on their turn, they're still going to have to worry about a 2/1 existing. If they try and put another minion on the board after they clear, we have a 2/1 that can receive buffs, trade into that minion, do whatever we need it to do, or at least still maintain some pressure, still get some damage off.
Mm-hmm.
So very good at trading into the board, very good when buffed. A 2/3 body is already quite strong early on. But certain other minions really enable this card. Like, if somebody wants to just ignore the fact that it has 2 attack, after all, it's a 3 mana minion with 2 attack. Our 1-drops have 2 attack in some cases. If they choose to ignore it, we can buff it with something like Defender of Argus, and now say, you have to trigger the Death Rattle on this. So, alongside some of those buffs, this card can be really good. It also has some synergy with Knife Juggler, doesn't it?
It does. So as soon as the Death Rattle gets triggered, the Knife Juggler immediately throws the knife. So, I mean, when you kill it, sometimes just randomly your other 2/1 just dies because the damage golem comes popping out.
Yeah, it sets up a threat on the board that if you haven't already played your Knife Juggler, if you're holding it in hand, opponents may be afraid to fill the board with a bunch of 1-mana creatures, thinking like aggro decks or something, because they may very well get traded into with the Harvest Golem, and then one of those knives hits their tiny minion, and you've got a board advantage there. Alright, let's add some more cards. What's next?
What's next, I think, would be the sort of like the buff package, which would be Young Priestess, or Youthful Priestess. I don't know what it's called. Young Priestess.
Young Priestess.
That there's Defender of Argus, which we've talked so much about,
Mm-hmm.
and Direwolf. Is it Direwolf? I don't know what the names. I only know the pictures.
That's Direwolf Alpha.
Direwolf Alpha. Okay.
Yeah, Alpha.
And Shattered Sun Cleric. If that's the name, you never know.
No, you got it. You got it. How many copies of Shattered Sun Cleric?
I like running 2. I see lists that run 1. I think just +1/1 is really strong. And it's 1/1 with charge because you're giving it to a minion already on the board.
Yeah.
So that 1/1 comes into effect immediately, helps you create a sticky board. There is another list that I do run a lot in Zoo that only runs 1, but we can talk about that list later, I think.
Mm-hmm. So let's go through some of these then. Young Priestess first. This is slightly different. It doesn't allow us any extra attack on the board, but it does give a random minion +1 health at the end of our turn. When do we want to deploy this card, and why does it work so well with the deck?
You deploy this card as soon as possible. So when you think about this card, really it's a 1-mana 2/2. So you're already getting premium stats for this card. And if you have a minion already on the board, Young Priestess is great because that minion just got harder to kill, especially early on where damage is more limited. Now my Flame Imp is a 3/3 turn 1, especially if I have coin and I coin Flame Imp Young Priestess. Now I've just got a 3/3 turn 1 and the 2/1. But you need to kill the 2/1 because it gives the buffs. But then you're leaving a 3/3 on the board, and you sort of don't want to do that. You're running into some trouble. Or even buffing up the Leper Gnome. Now I've got a 2/2. Just as soon as you can play this card, you play it. Maybe not on turn one when you don't have the coin, you don't play it, but if you have nothing else, like just tempoing that out is even not so bad.
Right, I think the same thing is true of Abusive Sergeant, is that if you absolutely have no other one-drops to play, it's okay to play Abusive or Young Priestess on turn one.
Mhm.
It's better to be practical and get some board control as early as possible. Much more important than trying to save the value of getting 1 extra HP off of this minion. Now, she can't buff herself either. This is only to a random friendly minion. So Priestess will always stay 2-1 unless you got 2 on the board. She'll always stay at 2-1. And it's a card that we might want to protect as well. Do we have any early protection for this card?
We do with the Voidwalker, so you sort of protect it with another minion, and then your opponent sort of has to choose what they want to do. Because the Priestess is a 2-1, right? It's only doing 2 damage, but it sort of creates a taunt for your other minions. So in a way, other minions protect it, but it also protects other minions.
Yeah, it's that interesting kind of symbiotic relationship there, where and this is common, I think, in aggro decks, where you put several high priority threats on the board at the same time, and it creates a situation where the opponent needs to remove the Priestess, because the longer she stays on the board, the harder it is to AoE the board down. But at the same time, once they remove the Priestess, which, they may have to use something ineffective for, all of a sudden, like you mentioned, we have things like a 3/3 Flame Imp. And that's a difficult body to remove early on in the game, especially if you're already maybe spending some mana or resources removing the Young Priestess. Let's take a look at this Direwolf. Tell me a little bit about that.
So Zoo will frequently have a couple minions on the board, and Direwolf is 2 mana 4/2, if you want to think of it like that.
Mm-hmm.
So this card sort of controls 4 damage, and that matters a lot to your opponents. That will sometimes feel like they have to clear the Direwolf over your other minions because it's sort of occupying four damage worth of stats hitting your face. So this is a very powerful card in buffing up your creatures. And it's also 2 of its damage is also charge, right? If you're buffing your minions already on the board, then that's damage coming into effect immediately. So if I'm giving my Leper Gnome an extra attack immediately, then now all of a sudden it's a 3/1 and can trade favorably into a whole range of creatures. Or even if I'm buffing my Flame Imp, now it's a 4/2 and it can kill even like Azure Drakes and stuff. So it's pretty strong.
Yeah, one of the things that I notice about this deck is that as far as buffs go, we have a couple of ways to buff our minions to do 1 more damage. So we have Direwolf, and we have Defender of Argus and Shattered Sun for that. And we also have cards like Abusive Sergeant or Dark Iron Dwarf that we'll talk about a little bit later, that give 2 damage. And when you're playing with so many creatures that have 1, 2, or 3 attack, and you have buffs that give you 1 or 2 attack, it can lead to a lot of situations where it's just very convenient for us to choose the right tool to do the exact amount of damage that we need to remove a taunt or something else, another scary minion, and proceed just hitting face, right?
Yep. It's just you're just trading so efficiently with Zoo, and then you're playing these minions that are just getting premium stats, and you can have the answer in a minion form against a wide range of creatures that your opponent plays, and you sort of just grind them out in the early game because you're getting so much more for the exact same amount of mana.
Absolutely. So we already talked a little bit about Shattered Sun. Why do you think some people choose to include only 1 copy of this card in their lists?
Right, so it's 3 mana, 3/2. If you have the 1/1, it's 4/3 worth of stats, and that's okay. But sometimes it's like, I think you can do better, right? Some of the other cards do a lot more than Shattered Sun Cleric, right? So I don't know, but I do like this. It occupies the 3 mana slot, which I think is needed. The 1/1, because not only am I giving attack, I'm also giving HP, and I think the HP is very valuable, especially when you're playing against sort of higher level players, right? Where the attack is scary, but the health and the stickiness is even more scary.
Yeah. No, it is 3 mana, but it's still a 3 mana 3/2 is pretty decent. It also helps us sometimes on when we're moving into turn 4 and turn 5. We're starting to think about our opponent's AoE options as well. And I think this minion usually comes at a pretty decent time where we can upgrade one of our minions to just have enough health to be out of reach of some of those AoE spells as well. So whereas, we may not want to commit super hard to the board with several cards at once, on turn 3 we might not want to play 3 1-drops together, or a 2-drop and a 1-drop. We can play Shattered Sun, get 1 charge damage essentially out of it, buff a minion out of range of AoE removal, and just kind of keep that pressure up. Now I wanted to talk... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I know. I forgot completely about Defender of Argus. Let's talk about this card.
Yeah. So walk me through this. A 4-mana creature, 2/3 body. It's maybe not the most impressive, but it gives +1/+1 to adjacent minions and also gives them taunt. So first, let's talk about the adjacent minions +1/+1. What's the value of that?
Right. So I think this is one of the strongest cards in Zoo, outside of the obvious. And so again, the HP is crucial to creating the stickiness that you need in the board. And so the +1/+1 you're giving to 2 minions, so it's +2/+2.
Mm-hmm.
That has charge, so you can use that damage immediately. It's not just attacks, so you're getting the stickiness and the threat of the damage, and that whole package is just a lot for just one card. It also gives taunt, which doesn't seem like a lot, but by the time you're playing Defender of Argus, it's kind of late into the game, and maybe now I'm getting a little bit worried about my opponent sort of using all of their burns, Leroy, Shadowstep, Coldblood, cards like that. Late game, I like to think around, it might be reasonable for my opponent to have a 3-card combo late into the game. So this lets me I no longer have to worry about that, because now I just have 2 taunts as well. So I can't really do anything.
And of all of these 1-drops here that we've got on the list, which one do you think is most benefited by us playing Defender of Argus and buffing it?
I mean, it really depends who you're playing against. I think the Squire having the Divine Shield and the taunt is really useful. And then the 2/2 is pretty helpful, but at that point, you're still getting only 2 hits. It's tanking 2 hits, whether it's a 1/1 or a 2/2.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that doesn't really matter against some decks. Sometimes I like buffing the Voidwalker. You sort of double up on the taunt, but that 4 damage or 4 HP range can be out of reach for maybe a lightning bolt or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that also gets pretty strong. Sometimes it just depends on what you have on the board. Where I'm at this point of the game, maybe I don't have the luxury of being so picky of who I defender, and just defendering 2 creatures is just what I needed to do.
Yeah, one thing I also wanted to note here about Direwolf and Defender of Argus is that we do see Defender of Argus sometimes in other decks. Occasionally we see it like mid-range Shaman, stuff like that, but we don't even really see Direwolf in Shaman decks where they're going to summon a bunch of things, a bunch of totems. And we don't really see it in aggressive Paladin lists or any kind of Paladin list where you'd expect to flood the board more. So one thing I do want to point out about Zoo is because we play so many 1-drops and so many early creatures, and because our deck is so dedicated to creatures, playing them every turn, it's one of the very few decks where we can take advantage of this adjacency and feel like we consistently have targets for Direwolf and for Defender, as opposed to defending just one thing that we have on the board, or Direwolfing one thing we have on the board. We can almost always get the full value out of these cards.
Something I forgot to mention about the Direwolf is I said it was a 4/2, but it actually sometimes is a 5/2 or a 6/2, because when the minion dies, it just busts the next minion. So you have a bunch of sort of brittle 1-drop minions, and that Flame Imp goes, uses its 1 damage and kamikazes itself, and then your Argent Squire is right on up next to Direwolf Alpha, and then you got to use that 1 damage again. So extra value. That's what I think is why you see this in Zoo, but maybe not in other decks, because Paladin, you've got sort of all your bubbles and you sort of can't do that. And Shaman runs sort of better Direwolf Alpha and in the totem, it's +2 attack.
Right, exactly. Now, one of the things that I notice high-level Shaman players doing with regard to that Flame Tongue is that they'll make sure that any time they put a minion on the board, their minions are in such a sequence that they can best take advantage of Flame Tongue for whatever threat they're expecting. when we're building our zoo board and expecting, because we have 2 copies of Direwolf and because we're probably tapping and trying to get more cards in our hand, how do we set up our board to take advantage of the Direwolf best? And by that I mean, I know it's different for every matchup, but in general, where do we put our death rattles? Where do we put our bubbles? Where do we put our weak minions? And where do we put those strong minions that we don't really want to use for trading, like Knife Juggler?
Right. I like to think of it like minions that will stop the chain of constant direwolf attacks. You put at the sort of at the ends. So I'll put the bubbles and the death rattles on the side ends of my direwolf, like as far to the left or as far to the right as I can.
Mm-hmm.
That way I can fully maximize the value. And I'll put the knife juggler and priestess like close to the ends. But if I don't really care if I need to like kill them off to get value. So as long as they're not ending the chain, then it's fine to trade those guys in.
That's interesting. I think maybe there are several ways to go about this. Obviously, putting the minions that are most likely to die that you care the least about, like Abusive Sergeant or Leper Gnome, toward the middle, I think is almost always correct. Sometimes I think of minions like Knife Juggler or others that you may not want to trade so much. Putting those to the very far left, in Zoo it doesn't make too much of a difference whether it's far left or far right, but for Shaman it does.
Mm-hmm.
So the very far left for things like that. Maybe Manatide Totem is a good example of that, where I may want to buff it at some point, but I'm actually happier just leaving it on the board to draw me cards. I don't really want it to see combat when another minion could trade in there. So
I think something on that is if I sort of have it in my chain being buffed currently, and my opponent wants to kill it anyways. So if I have it on the end, like a Manatide Totem all the way on the end, then it's just a 0/3, and my opponent's just going to kill that for free. But if I have it sort of in the chain, my opponent's going to kill that, but now it has to kill it as a 2/3, and then I'll still get the buff of the Flame Totem sort of after it dies. So I think that's another way to think about it. But it also matters like just hitting those damage breakpoints on some minions. So.
All right, well, I'm going to be right back. I got 100 games of Shaman to play right now with that newfound knowledge. I'll let you know how it goes. Yeah, so I would say one thing maybe just taking a step back from all of the kind of nitty gritty of this is just when anybody's playing a zoo deck, I think it's good to be aware that Direwolf could enter your hand at any point, and sometimes it doesn't matter where your minions are placed, and sometimes it really does matter. So maybe one of the good habits to get in when playing this deck is to always assume, wherever I put this minion, is this the best place for the Direwolf? Assume that it's going to come into our hand at some point and be prepared for that. Do you feel like that's decent advice?
I think that's great advice.
It gives us something to do also on those turns when we don't have that much to think about. But sequencing our minions on the board properly, it really can make or break games. You know, and our opponent can, a very high level opponent can see that we're not set up properly for a Direwolf to have a good trade into a big taunt, and we get stuck in a situation where we lose an extra minion on the board, which could have been swinging for damage. You know, maybe the thing that makes or breaks the game for us.
Yeah, some of these lists that run like Shield Bearer or cards that need to be buffed to have impact, it just becomes even more important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now we don't run Shield Bearer in this one, so don't get too worried about that.
That's good. I don't have it crafted anyway.
What? Dude, that's a 0 mana, 4 stats. Or 1 mana, 4 stats. That's crazy.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's 1 mana? Oh, it is 1 mana. I thought it was 0. I got 1 copy, so we can't play it anyway.
No, they made a 0 mana, 0 something taunt later on. That's what I was getting a little confused.
Oh, cool. Yeah, go standard. We do have another buff card here that we haven't really talked about too much. We've got Dark Iron Dwarf. What's the purpose of this one?
Yeah, this is the next one. So this one's it's like Abusive. It gives a +2 damage, which helps you trade. But it's a 4/4 body, and that becomes very relevant in some of these matchups where you need something to play later on in the game, where you can't just have the Doom Guard. Sometimes you just need that bigger body to help you create a stronger board later on. Yeah, so I think some people like to skimp out on these guys. Yeah, it's hard to remove. Some people sort of take 1 copy or even both copies of Dark Iron out of their list, but I think the 4/4 body is quite important. So I would be cautious among removing all my end game cards.
Yeah, and again, part of what human players do well when they successfully pilot this deck is that they focus on creating a board that's diverse enough to answer multiple opponents' threats. So Dark Iron Dwarf, it is a target for swipe. It has 4 HP. But outside of that, if we imagine Consecrate or Explosive Trap, Dark Iron Dwarf does dodge a lot of AoE removals. And so, again, one of those tools that we use when we're trying to fight against these control decks or anything that's going to N for 1-us, like, or, could 7 for 1-us. We like to build a board that's got enough diversity to handle those threats, and Dark Iron does that really well. Yeah, it helps us trade into something, and it can help us get face damage done, but it also provides a body that dodges a lot of those AoEs, and I think that's where a lot of the value comes from with this card. Okay, so we got Dark Iron Defender. Go ahead.
I think we're down to one last card.
Mm-hmm.
It's the worst card in the entire deck, and that is Amani Berserker. Oh, it totally is the worst card in the deck.
Okay. Tell us about Amani Berserker. Why is that?
I don't have two golden Amanis. So this card, I wouldn't even put in, like, it feels bad to even put this card in the deck because it doesn't trade very favorably, and it's not that sticky. Like, the most sticky part about this card is it has 3 HP. Now, the Enrage almost never really matters. I mean, sometimes it'll matter. It makes it hard to clear, so that comes with the stickiness, I guess. But typically this won't be attacking for 5 damage. So it's just a 2/3 body that you're just playing. And sometimes it feels like all my other cards in Zoo have, like, all the things that we're talking about. Oh wow, this card gives +2 damage, and all the use cases of that. Or this card summons a 2/1 body after it dies. Or this card busts other cards. Amani doesn't do any of that. But I think you do need the 2-drop in the deck, and you want something with a little bit of HP. And it sort of feels awkward to clear in my mind because it's got the Enrage. So it sort of just slots in there at the 29th and 30th slot.
Yeah, I imagine, let's say we take a card like River Croc and put it in this deck.
Mm-hmm.
Our opponent plays Explosive Trap or Consecration. The River Croc is now just a 2/1. Yeah, it's still a minion on the board, but it's not really taking advantage of the fact that our opponent used a clear spell. Whereas Amani Berserker, if we have a board that's very susceptible to Explosive or Consecration in general, or Holy Nova, we can play this Amani Berserker. And now they're going to get punished for removing, a couple of minions that did 2 damage, 1 damage, 3 damage. And we're going to get to make some of that up with our swing on the next turn. Are there ever any concerns about playing Amani Berserker without playing Elven Archer to activate it?
I'm not a big fan of self-activating the Amani. And the reason why is because I think 2 damage, or having 2 HP, is a breakpoint that a lot of decks have access to. And I feel like you're crippling your own position by greeting for that 3 damage. So you're using the Elven Archer, so you're actually losing 1 damage. You're creating an easier breakpoint for your opponent to kill the Amani, and you're only getting a net 2 extra damage. And I feel like you could be doing more than that if you're not sort of shooting yourself.
Right. Also, just there's an opportunity cost here as well with the
Elven Archer. You're missing the clean trades of the Elven Archer to the 1 extra damage to kill something.
Yeah, absolutely. And Elven Archer, usually, I've had trouble pointing it at the board in the past, and I'm sure a lot of people share that concern with me. So, a hard card to just physically navigate this one as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. So we've got our full list here. This is our more or less standard list that we're going to talk about. This is something you can take onto the ladder, and you can play it just about any time against any other deck, and you're going to have a reasonable chance. So this one's good, but we had a couple other deck lists that we were going to look at here. So let me bring up. You've got one that's a little bit more geared toward the Zoo mirror. If you're facing a lot of Zoo bots with Zoo. And you got a couple of different choices in here. So walk me through what have we subbed out and what have we put in?
Right. So sort of like the mindset behind this one is I play Shaman and Druid as my 2 other classes. And when Zoo is popular on the ladder, which is always, I can't play my decks, which means I always can't play any of the decks that I want to play. So the third class that I do play is Zoo. And so I need a Zoo that does well into Zoo. So in come the Elven Archers, in come the Mortal Coils, and I'm in come these extra 1-drops, and I'm going to be more consistent and also have more control over the board than the zoo bots.
So Elven Archer, absolutely great at trading. Has some synergy with Knife Juggler as well, just can provide enormous swing turns. Had several frustrating games yesterday where Zoo coined Juggler into double Elven Archer against Aggro Paladin. So this can absolutely decimate in a close battle with other decks that are putting lots of cheap minions on the board. It really helps snowball things. And it can also ping off, if we try and trade up, we have 5 damage to trade up into a Druid of the Claw. Elven Archer can come into ping, so it's not like it's completely useless against every other deck. Maybe not as high statted as these other ones, but not completely useless.
It's still a really strong card because it just what it does is it again helps with this idea of trading favorably. Is you just ping and that extra damage goes right on.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of pings, Coil is in there too.
Yeah, there's a second ping, and a lot of the time when I think of Zoo, I like to think of archers and coils sort of occupying the same slot where it's like, do I want to put archers in or do I want to put coils at that 1 damage answer? Mm-hmm. And I sort of break the rule here and I put in both. And the reason for that is because when I see a lot of Zoo on the board, on the ladder, having more consistent ways of doing that 1 damage ping really lets you control the game. Where earlier on, let's say they put down the Abusive or put down the Leper Gnome, or even if one of their other minions has taken damage, or like the Argent Squire's shield is popped, or one of my 2/1s trade into the Voidwalker. There are just so many cases where having a 1 damage to just pick off that minion would be so useful, and I don't want to use my minions and waste their damage and HP to do those trades. So I added 3 ways to sort of ping off those minions. I've seen another list that runs 2 archers and 2 coils, and I do like that list, but I feel like sometimes I reach points where I'm sitting on 2 coils in my hand and I sort of don't know what to do with them. And coil sort of becomes or sometimes when you don't have these perfect trades, I think overloading on these answers is a mistake. So you just only put 1 coil in.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying there is valuable too, and just kind of the greater context of how we construct a deck, is that we can imagine the best case scenario, a bunch of 1-drops, and then Coil comes into our hand the second that we need it. But we also have to remember that there are certain hands that we can get, like having double Soulfire or double Doomguard. And Mortal Coil, double Coil can be one of those. It can be absolutely dead if we're playing against something like Druid, where we really wanted to have an actual minion to put on the board, extend our advantage, whatever else. And instead we've got Coil, which just isn't, 1 damage really isn't significant against certain classes. So I like what you did there. I like how you've subbed in 3 cards instead of overreacting and putting the full anti-Zoo suite in there at the expense of, winning the matchups that we were already trying to win. What have we removed in order to put these 3 cards in the 2 archers and the coil?
Right. So I removed 3 of the worst cards from this deck, but I did 1 of each and I aim to sort of even out what I'm taking out. Where I don't want to take out 2 Dark Iron Dwarves because I feel like I need that card, and I don't want to take out 2 Shattered Sun Clerics because I like the Shattered Sun Cleric, and I don't want to take out 2 Amanis because I like the Amanis, right? And I want things on my 2 drops. I want to draw my 3 drops, and I want that 4/4 body and the +2 attack. So I take out 1 of each in order to still sort of even out the curve. And yeah, and I don't want to, I mean, that curve looks insane that you pulled it up, 15 1-drops, but you sort of don't want to mess with those later games too much.
Right, and it's something that, just as a side note, we've seen in tournament play. Some players bring extremely anti-something lists, and we can never really lose sight of the fundamental goal of a deck and what it's supposed to do in the matchups it's really supposed to excel in and try and win in. And some players sort of neglect that in favor of bringing all of these different tech options. And pretty much universally what we see is with our most effective tournament competitors, they will typically have about 3 tech slots in each deck, but they're unwilling to budge on other things. So if we were to take out another card here, would we want to lose our proactive 2-drop and completely remove Amani if we wanted a second coil? Probably not. Same thing with Shattered Sun and Dark Iron. Removing any one of these cards, both copies, kind of leaves us in a position where it throws off our curve, doesn't allow us to have those perfect games where you just go 1, 2, 3, 4, and you've got all the cards you need. So I really like how you don't overreact and you just say, okay, 3 copies is enough, right? 2 coil, two archers and a coil, that'll do. So, for those at home, if you're ever facing this if you're ever facing a lot of Zoo on the ladder, feel free to tech in a couple of different options. These deck lists are flexible, they're not set in stone, there are always different options. Amber, do you think if we're facing a lot of weapon classes, is there ever an argument to be made for Swamp Ooze, or do we already do pretty well against weapons?
I mean, against Rogue, I sort of don't like teching for Rogue because you're gonna lose anyways. So I wouldn't put it in for Rogue.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you do okay into Hunter, and I don't know if I really want to sacrifice a card for Ooze and Hunter, especially because it's not like every game will be Hunter, right? If I saw only Hunter, maybe I would have put it in,
Depends
but it's
on
not.
them.
I don't think it's I don't think I see enough Hunter to like ever to justify this. And the other weapon is Paladin. I think I beat Paladin with Zoo, so I'm not worried about that. Or Warrior, I think you're losing anyways, regardless of whether you have Ooze in it or not. Well, actually, War is interesting. We can talk about that later, but I wouldn't put Ooze to beat Warrior.
Yeah, I like that explanation. And I think, one thing that some people may not recognize as well is that this card is bad into the Zoo Mirror, and it's pretty bad in aggro mirrors as well. Mm-hmm. When played as a proactive 2-drop for 3/2, it just doesn't do the things that we actually want this deck to do. Buffing this up doesn't really make much sense because it's got 2 health if we're trading up with a 2 health minion. Not great. And because it doesn't have 3 health like the Amani, we're probably not going to get a 2-for-1 with this card. In fact, it'll probably get traded into by a Leper Gnome or something like that.
I mean, we're not running Bloodfin Raptor, so we're not running a acidic Swamp Ooze.
Yeah, that's it. That's a good point. I like that. All right, so we've taken a look at this anti-Zoo list. We had one more that we were going to take a look at here as well. And now this one's a little bit more experimental. This is kind of an archetype that continues to evolve. We've seen some players be very successful with this certain variation. And this is kind of the burst version of Zoolock. So first of all, what is this deck? What class are we tending to target a little bit more? What matchup are we trying to make better here?
Right, so I do want to point out that I know there's a guy on NA who's rank 3 right now who is playing this all day and beating all my whatever I've been playing today. And he's running a very cycle-oriented version of this deck. Mm-hmm. Now, this one doesn't run all the blue Murloc dudes and all the draw cards. Oh wait, there's Nozdormu in this card one too. I don't think this is the list I sent you. Yeah. Anyway, so this one doesn't have all the cycle that gets ran in that guy's deck. I think LOK Shadow is running more sort of this style where it sort of gets this draw by just controlling the board and doing what Zoo normally does, and just tapping a lot more. So I'm getting my draw from tapping and sort of buying time for myself by dominance over the board instead of these cycle oriented versions. And so
so cards like Loot Hoarder, although they may seem to be sort of redundant with the Warlock hero power, if we're trying to find a combo with like Power Overwhelming, Soulfire, Arcane Golem, kinds of things like that, or Leroy, we don't play Faceless to copy them, but when we're trying to have those burst combos in the deck, it can be just helpful to cycle to those more quickly. We're not so concerned about board control if we're trying to play a more combo-oriented style.
And this gives you the 2-1 body as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's a good proactive turn 2 play if the opponent hasn't put anything on the board yet. It's ready to trade into something, draws us a card. It's also something, because of the death rattle, that if we're afraid of our opponents clearing our board and we need something to do after we tap, we can put Loot Hoarder on the board. And we don't really care. Opponent spends a card on it, we get a card back. Not such a big deal. So, This particular variant, because, you know, a lot of times we'll be choosing exactly which variant of a deck we want to play, depending on the ladder meta. So this one I would say is maybe a little bit better against one of those bad matchups like Rogue. Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Where sort of in these games where Rogue is sapping all your minions and killing your minions as soon as they get placed down and they're drawing a billion cards.
Mhm.
Imagine if I could deal like 16 damage from hand. Where normally Zoo plays that Doom Guard, loses 2 cards, and I hit you for 5, but then I sort of need cards on the board to finish off the game. Where
Mhm.
this one you clearly don't. I've got Leroy. I can buff it twice with Power Overwhelming. That's 14 damage right there
Mhm.
for 3 cards, and only 6 mana too. And maybe I toss a Soulfire in there too. And now you're just dead.
Yeah.
Or just the various combos you can do with all this extra damage.
Mhm. And certainly against Rogue players, it looks like this list also has a couple of options that are extra strong against Rogue.
Yeah, so you've got Nozdormu in the deck, and
Right.
that shortens the turn to 15 seconds. Now I've
Okay.
watched rogues play these games, and they rope me every time.
Mhm.
And so they wait until the rope is sort of half gone before they really start doing anything. So
Mhm.
this sort of forces them to play the game and stop thinking. And
Mhm.
some rogues don't have the APM to actually win against Nozdormu.
Yeah, they might be tabbed out at the same time too. You never know. And all
That's
of a
true.
sudden they return and it's not their turn anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I play this game during work, and sometimes if I'm writing an email, I spend 15 seconds to write that email and then play my turn.
Mhm.
And Nozdormu cuts that right out of the game.
Yeah, that's a pretty incredible insight. I think that this card, generally, we see this in pretty much every single deck that we've covered so far in the Deck Spotlight series. I assume that we're going to continue to see Nozdormu in virtually every deck that we cover in the future as well. Just all in
Yeah,
all, probably the best craft in Classic.
I think even a tournament option too. I was watching
Yeah.
the tournaments recently, and people were roping, and they couldn't even use all their cards. They missed some of their. Some I think lost the game because they
Hmm.
couldn't clear the board. Now,
Yeah.
if you played Nozdormu, that's going to happen a lot more frequently.
Yeah, and those, you know, if you think about it, if people are taking like the full 90 seconds for their turn, and you play Nozdormu, and they're playing all their cards at the end of the turn, they might just not even play those cards, right? They might just
Yeah,
be
they might not play a
totally short
single
circuit.
card.
Yeah, it's just a free turn for us.
I mean, I saw Life Coach kill a Nozdormu over higher value targets just because of how powerful this card is.
Hmm. Yeah, it really, it brings the mental game in as well, something that we don't always
Mhm.
see. Yeah, and there's another one in here too. This guy, it's a absolutely bananas choice. Tell us a little bit about King Mukla.
Yeah, King Mukla is a great card. I love running decks with King Mukla. He's a 3 mana 5/5. If you have coin, you can play this on turn 2. And most decks just can't do anything against Mukla. I've seen people feed Mukla his own bananas to get him into big game hunter range, and that's like 5 mana worth of stats to kill this monkey dude, and
Hmm.
that just sounds terrible saying out loud.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
this card is so awkward to kill. I don't. It's like it looks so strong in Zoo where it's like, man, I wish I could just play a 5/5 in Zoo.
Hmm.
Like, how would my opponent ever deal with that? But I'm a little worried about drawing Mukla late game, so that's why I don't have him in my list because late game I play Mukla, but like everyone has all the removal at this point of the game, and he just dies. And now my opponent has 2 bananas, and they buff their own characters to trade favorably, and I want to be the one trading favorably, not my opponent. So I can't give them those bananas, which also sometimes end up as fodder for auctioneer, and that kind of sucks.
Yeah, Pyromancer, another
Oh,
healthy
for sure.
eater that enjoys, fruit on a regular basis. Probably not the kind of thing that we'd like to feed. For those at home, those cards are not actually in the deck. Appreciate you indulging me. Dark Iron Dwarf is the card that finishes this one off. So let's look at a couple of the options that we have here. So we've cut out a few cards and replaced them. One of those things is
Yeah.
Power Overwhelming. We haven't talked about Power Overwhelming too much so far. Tell me,
Right.
tell me about this card. Maybe it's obviously good, in a burst deck, but why don't we play this in regular Zoo?
So one of the reasons why you don't, I've actually seen lists that do run this card, but I think sometimes you get stuck with 2 of these in your hand, and then you just don't have anything to do with it because you're killing off your own minion to using these. And really, you really don't want to be doing that. And you're trading so favorably anyways that four damage instead of like a +2 from Abusive just isn't necessary. And then you're killing your minions. So I just rather have sort of more efficient and better cards to do those kind of trades. Where in this aggro deck, you're using this as a finisher. And so in regular zoo, you sort of don't want this card because you just don't want it in your hand. Where in this burn lock, you sort of take that sacrifice to run that card because you know that it's 4 damage. You're comboing with a charger at the end of the game.
And you're not worried that a strongly board-oriented card like Leroy would maybe die as a result of having this PO on him?
I mean, the Leroy is going to die to the 2/1/1 whelps in a lot of circumstances. So buffing him up only to die, I mean, you're just using him as a finisher. So it really doesn't matter that he's going to die or that you're even summoning whelps for your opponents.
Right. And another thing I think is if we're playing a traditional zoo list with Owl, I would consider Power Overwhelming to be a little bit stronger. One of the things, the neat little tricks we can do to trade is we use Power Overwhelming to buff a minion, hopefully not one with a death rattle, and swing it into something, maybe let's say an Amani Berserker, and then we silence that minion to get the Power Overwhelming off. It'll fully heal the minion, it'll give it that 4 extra HP, and after it trades, if we silence it, it'll remain with that amount of HP. So I would say maybe this card, if some folks out there are thinking about how to improve upon this deck or how to go in a different direction, PO and an Owl may be one little niche possibility. It may not be good. It may be irrelevant in most situations, but it's also something to consider. It's worth considering, I think.
For sure. I think one core card we should talk about here is actually one of the cards we removed, and that's Doomguard.
Mm-hmm.
So you can only add 30 cards.
I'll put what's his name?
Even 31, I probably wouldn't even put a Doomguard in here. And that seems like this is like sacrilege on my zoo gospel here, because Doomguard is such a powerful card. Can it really be cut from zoo? Because this seems like the reason why, or part of the reason why zoo is so good, because you've got this 5-mana 5/7 body. But we're taking it out because discarding 2 cards in a deck sort of focused around holding these combo pieces is actually just killing your win con if you discard your Power Overwhelmings.
Mm-hmm.
So Doomguard less important, and sometimes less important in this deck because his battle cry now is actually becoming a liability. And so you just take him out, you add in some other chargers, and call it a day.
One of the big things about Doomguard is it has 5 attacks, so it trades favorably into pretty much anything. But it also has this 7 HP that we're paying for, and part of this battle cry of discarding 2 random cards. Part of what we're paying for is really this 7 HP. We're not paying for the 5 attack. We can get that with many charge minions. So not having this in the deck, it may seem at first like, well, it's a charge minion, of course you play Doomguard, but our goal is not necessarily just to rapidly control the board. We're more focused on doing burn damage with this combo, maybe tapping a little bit more to try and find our combo pieces. So yeah, like you say, antithetical to the approach that we're trying to take, which is find Power Overwhelming, play Power Overwhelming with some of these chargers. So you've chosen to have 2 Arcane Golems in here, and 1 Wolf Rider and 1 Leroy. Are there ever any worlds in which we take out one of these Wolf Riders, add another one in? What do you think?
So I was tinkering around with a list that was running a 6-mana charger. I think he's called. I mean, he's got a bubble. I don't know what any of these cards. Yeah, Argent Commander.
Mm-hmm.
I was tinkering around with a list with this because you charge in, you can kill something, and then he sticks on the board, which I thought was pretty strong. But I took it out because 6 mana is a bit too much for a zoo list. Because then if you're stuck with a 6-mana card in your hand, that's just going to feel so bad as the zoo player. So I took him out. I think 4 chargers is a reasonable amount where you're going to draw 1 or 2, and that's sort of enough. I don't really necessarily think you want to overload it on the chargers, but again, there's someone on rank 3 on NA right now who beat me quite a few times running 2 bluegills, 2 wolf riders, 2 arcane golems, and a Leroy. So I mean, I guess there's something to be said about that list.
Yeah, I will mention that those lists tend to be a little bit worse when they're facing traditional matchups that they have to trade a lot on the board. One of the things about our conventional list that we looked at first here was that there's almost always a way to value trade up into something or to buff our minions in a good way that controls the board better. And once we start putting bluegills and wolf riders and arcane golems and Leroy in the deck, we've removed 4 things that could potentially be affecting the board where we can just win with the current minions we have. And these are terrible cards when we're facing like Feral Spirit or something like that. We do not want to be running chargers into a 2-3 taunt or something like that. So these cards do diminish a lot in value in those aggro versus aggro matchups in some ways. And in other ways, they do gain value because a lot of times aggro decks don't play healing or many taunts, so we might just find a way to sneak past them with Arcane or Leroy to just decisively win a race as well. So, like you say, it's a double-edged sword. We're never 100% sure what the best option is going to be as far as number of chargers, but I like the number that you put in here where you're not going absolutely overboard with cards that can really be detrimental to our other matchup win rates. All right, well, we've had a chance to look at a whole bunch of cards here. I'm curious, are there other variants of Zoo that you'd want to talk about before we take a chance to play a couple of games with this?
Right, so there's a lot of sort of like classic Zoo cards that aren't in any of my decks, and that is the, notably the Shield Bearer. Now, a lot of people hate Shield Bearer, and they'll never run it in Zoo, but it was in the original Zoo list, and I do think it has value, provided that you have something to activate this card. So this card occupies the 1 mana slot, which is just good to have all these 1 mana cards in your Zoo list. It gives you 4 stats for only 1 mana, which is more than any other card that you can play. But you do need to buff it. And so that's why I don't include it in my list. But it does provide the taunt, which some people think, well, if I'm drawing Shield Bearer late in the game, that's terrible. But it does have value in the late game where if I put down the Shield Bearer, it sort of protects my whole board. Even with no attack, it becomes a little bit awkward for someone with maybe the 3 damage weapon like a bow or a war axe. Now they can't kill off some of my creatures because they have to use the swing and something else to kill the Shield Bearer. And I think it's a good card, but it just doesn't make the cut anymore. It's not great.
Yeah, creating conditionals in decks, especially those that are supposed to be very consistent with their generic list, adding those conditionals like, I will play Shield Bearer, but I can only play it if I have another buff minion. It starts to diminish the value that we have of having such consistency with like 16 1-drops in that traditional list here, or 12 1-drops in here. It's like we absolutely want to play the thing that we need to on every single turn and have it be relevant to the board. If we play Shield Bearer and it's our 1-drop and we have no Dire Wolf, we have no Abusive, nothing to buff it up, no Argus later on, it really reduces that slim margin that this deck needs to win, in order to push enough damage. Also, just can't trade into anything, right? You have a creature on the board that may not ever be able to attack. Okay, so I had a couple of high-level things I wanted to talk about here with you, just briefly, if you don't mind indulging. So I think that some players have a misconception that Zoo is this profoundly binary deck, because if it loses the board, it just loses the game. Absolute, end of sentence. And I think that while this may be true of bots, I'm hoping you can speak to that and help us understand if the deck is maybe just a little bit more nuanced than this binary representation that we get by observing what bots do with it.
Right. So there is the idea of Zoo doesn't have a lot of ways to get back after the board gets cleared, and that's true. But I guess the idea is you just don't lose the board in the first place. So when your opponent is... I know all the cards in my opponent's deck likely because all the deck lists are fairly refined. So I know what their board clear options are. So if I'm against Shaman, I know that at some point Lightning Storm will be their answer. So I want to put my minions at 3 HP and maybe half of them will survive, or even push them to 4 HP and I know that they will survive. Against Hunter, I know Explosive Trap is 2 damage all around. And so I will be bumping my minions up to 3 HP and maybe holding back a card that if I got 1 more mana, a bot would just play that card. But I might just hold on to it because I'm sort of feeling it out.
Yeah.
Some of these big ticket board clears as well, like Consecration and Holy Nova and Flame Strike and Blizzard and stuff like that, they cost a lot of mana. So when my opponent uses them and clears my board, they typically don't have any mana left over to develop their own board after it, which then coming back to my turn, I just played down more minions on the board. And I didn't really gain much except stopping the damage that was on my board at that current turn.
Yeah, I really like how you said that, and I think it's important that just that way that you have of envisioning what is my opponent going to play. Always asking yourself, what can they do to stop my board from being strong? And I think you hit the nail on the head where you say, don't lose the board. Right? There are certain times where you just can't, you can't play around certain things that your opponent has. But at the same time, most instances of playing any deck in Hearthstone, aggro or whatever, we do have a lot of choices of what to play, and especially when we have so many 1-drops in this list and such a low curve, you might think, oh, just play out anything, right? But that's not really how we want to do it. Sometimes we conserve mana. Sometimes we get into a position where we're ahead on the board and our opponent can't easily answer it, and adding more minions to the board just means they're going to be cleared anyway, right? They're not going to affect the board state. It's just a trigger for our opponent to say, oh, cool, now I can kill 5 minions instead of 3 with Consecration. Yeah, things like that. And we have this Warlock hero power as well, right? Is that when our opponent is baiting us, very clearly baiting us to fill up the board more quickly, we can just start life tapping. Spend half your mana on your turn, drawing a second card, so that we can flood later. We're not actually in as much of a hurry as maybe some players think to finish the game with Zoo. We can go the mile, right? We can kind of play the long game here because of the power of life tap.
Yeah, something that I've never seen a bot do is tap and then not play any of their minions. Sometimes it's situational, but if my board is strong enough, sometimes I'll just tap and I won't play a single other minion. I'll just punt the rest of the mana and I'll just say to my opponent, my board is strong enough, you have to remove it eventually. But I don't think I need to overcommit to win.
Yeah, exactly. That idea of overcommitting is really crucial in the way that a human would pilot this deck as compared to a bot. Is that we just know sometimes we have enough damage on the board. If our opponent's not going to kill us, maybe we have a couple of taunts up to prevent Leroy, whatever. Then we can feel safe and we can feel okay about just tapping and continuing to always know that we're going to have enough cards in hand that we're going to be able to create a new sticky board as soon as our opponent deals with our current one. We had a quick question here in the chat. I'm wondering if you can help address this card here. We've got Sack Pact that could be a potential anti-Zoo card, or it kills Jiraxis as well if you're playing against Handlock. What's your opinion on Sack Pact?
So Sacrificial Pact, right? When you're looking at this card, it sort of just is a terrible card because what runs demons in the game? Only Warlock, really. Yeah, only Warlock. The only way a demon gets on the board from another class is if they're like facelessing that one of your cards, which will never happen. So this is a useless card in 8 class matchups. So if you're teching in a card for one matchup, you better be seeing that class like 90%, much even more than 90%, maybe like 95% of your have to be Warlock before I would be considering putting Sacrificial Pact. And if I'm against Zoo, well, I've got other options to win the Zoo matchup that are more flexible in other matchups, where I don't really feel the need to put a Sacrificial Pact to beat the Zoo, when I could just put in some of these archers and the coils and sort of win the early game board, and then it doesn't. I don't need Sacrificial Pact because they'll never have the board for the entire game.
Yeah, and amongst the cards that we play here as well, not all of these are demons, right? We do have Flame Imp, we have Voidwalker, and we have Doomguard that are our demons, but that's only 3 of them. We can go an entire game playing this Zoo deck and not encounter any of those cards, in which case Sack Pact feels like, yes, it could swing the tempo early on, but it's just such a conditional card, like you mentioned, with first of all the matchups, but even within the Zoo versus Zoo matchup, it may not even be able to potentially swing the board. In some ways, it's just a Soulfire as well. Obviously, Doomguard, that's massive value. Zero mana, kill Doomguard, get to 5 health back, your opponent discards 2 cards. About the best card in the game, if you look at it that way. But if we're using this as like a tempo play early, which is usually who wins the early game board, removing Flame Imp could be powerful, but you can do the same thing with Soulfire as well. And playing both of them might throw off the consistency of the deck as far as how many creatures we have and how consistently we need to drop creatures in order to create a stickier and scarier board for our opponents.
One thing I do want to note about Zoo is Zoo's not so much of a deck list as it's a concept, right? Where you're trying to get those high value, low cost minions, and you want to make sticky boards that are good for efficient trades. And you can do that with a whole variety of cards. And I'm a big proponent of playing what feels right to you. I know Life Coach played Miracle Druid in many tournaments where Combo Druid is clearly better, and even Miracle Druid's good matchups. So if you find a lot of success with Sacrificial Pact, then run Sacrificial Pact, right? It's not so much of an exact science to me as playing what it feels right to you. So there's a lot. Zoo has a ton of options that you can play, like Argent. There's another Argent, a 3/1 Divine Shield. I see that get run a lot. I know there's the other options. I know one of my friends was running Pit Lord in Zoo, right? Whatever feels good to you, I think you should be running.
Pit Lord is one that we maybe don't have to talk about this card too much today, but we've seen Starforged get to second place, I believe, in one of our recent EU tournaments by running a Zoo version with Pit Lord, double Flame Imp, and double Hellfire, maybe single Hellfire, and then 2 Molten Giants. A Zoo deck that just puts the biggest things down that they possibly can at the cost of HP, and finds a way to cheat out those Molten Giants a lot earlier than a Zoo deck would ever be able to do. So we're not going to talk about it today, but it's one of those ideas that we could, people have been making modifications to this, even radical modifications to it, and have been successful with it. So it's not unlikely that this iteration of it, while very safe and reliable, it's not unlikely that there are cards that, if we take it just in a little bit different direction, could put in there and, transform some of those matchups.
I still have nightmares about the Black Knight and Zoo killing all my minions. So.
That Shield Bearer's got to watch out. So I think, one of the most difficult strategic concepts with aggressive decks is when we flip the switch from value trading on the board to doing face damage to our opponent. And it's a situational thing. It depends on how much HP our opponent has, whether they're playing a deck with heal in it or lots of taunts. But some decks like Face Hunter, Aggro Rogue, they run a lot of chargers and they have a lot of burn damage. So we're running 2 charge minions, we're running 2 Doom Guards here, and we're running 2 burn spells, 2 Soulfires. I'm curious, is there a difference in when we would flip the switch to go face with Zoolock as opposed to something with maybe more charge minions?
Yeah, so Zoolock, I like to point out that in Classic has a surprising amount of burst from hand. A lot of the way that I like to think of Classic is you get someone down to 15 HP and then you kill them from hand. And there are a lot of I like to think of 3-card combinations, but it could be sort of any amount that you want that do like 15 damage. So of course the classic Miracle Rogue, Leroy Shellstep, Coldblood, that's 16. In Shaman you've got the Doomhammer, Rockbiter, and Lightning Bolt, and that's 13 damage. Or Druid's got 14 damage and Force of Nature, Savage Roar. These are all combos that I can realistically expect later in the game I might have, and I can kill you from quite a healthy amount of HP. Now Zoo doesn't have that because I have my Doomguard, and that's dealing 5 damage, and realistically, you're not even going to be buffing this to 7 damage with Abusive Sergeant, because you're discarding 2 cards, and your abusive is probably being discarded. So your burst damage is sort of non-existent. So you can't flip the switch and say, okay, I'm going to just go all face, and then I'll just kill you from hand later, because you need to have the board. So you only really just go all face and go on the offensive when you know that your opponent has no way of dealing with your board, and you sort of know you're going to win is when you do it.
Yeah, I think it's a mistake that a lot of zoo players make as well, where they see somebody that's at like 15 HP and they see, well, I could swing with all my minions and get them down to, 7 HP, or I could do a bunch of really boring value trades on the board, trading my 2/2 into a 1/1 and trading my 2/3 into a 2/2, kind of that sort of stuff. Where we have these choices a lot, and it's not always as simple as all value trade or all face. Sometimes we want to just remove a couple of our opponent's minions with value trades and go face with the rest, even if we could be value trading. I think that maybe the concept of two-turn lethal, which is a concept that's been around forever in Hearthstone, is maybe a valuable one to kind of touch on. So can you explain what exactly is the two-turn lethal that we try and set up with this deck?
Yeah, so a two-turn lethal is, it's, I guess, when you've calculated that you've got like, you can kill someone in 2 turns, or like checkmate in 2, where I do something, my opponent can react, but no matter what they do, I'm just going to kill them the turn after. So typically I'll try to set those up. I'll know to flip the switch and go face, because I've got, let's say, like 10 damage on the board, and I deal my 10 damage, and then they're at like 4 HP left, maybe, just random numbers. But I know that there's no way they can put me down to 4 or kill off all my minions where I can't deal 4 damage. Or I've got a card like Soulfire or Second Doomguard in my hand to deal that last little bit of damage. Now, what I see sometimes, and the bots do this too, and I see human players do this as well, is they'll go for these 2-turn lethals, and then their board gets killed. They didn't have a sticky enough board, and it gets wiped. And then sort of what do you do? Because your opponent now has control of the board, and you'll likely never get it back this late in the game. And your opponent will just keep removing your minions. And even though they have 4 HP left, you can't really do anything about it except tap and wish you draw Soulfire, or wish you draw Doomguard. And that feels horrible as a zoo player. But, I mean, sometimes you get it, and then it feels really horrible for your opponent, because you top-decked the lethal. But you don't want to be in that position if you can help it. I mean, sometimes it happens, but if you can help it, don't put yourself in that position.
Yeah, and again, it's one of those things that goes back to reading your opponent's cards, trying to imagine what they have in hand. If they've only drawn through 10 cards and they've already played Swipe and 2 copies of Wrath, we might feel pretty safe about the board we have, and we might feel a little bit safer about going face. If we've seen them just sitting back and hero powering every turn, we might be a little bit suspicious, and it might not be the proper time for us to go face with everything. We might just want to do boring value trades on the board for a little bit. We've got our Warlock hero power. We can keep tapping. We can afford to extend the game long enough for our board to decisively do enough damage to finish our opponents.
Right. I like to think of reading your opponent's hand as like a game of poker, where you sort of want to put them on a card, or put them on a range of cards that they could possibly be. And you can do that by having turns where you can assume what's the best card my opponent can play here. And if that's Swipe, and they don't play Swipe, then I can safely assume that their entire hand is void of any Swipe. And then I can play knowing the fact that if they have to draw Swipe in order to use it. So in any future turns, I can play with the knowledge of they likely just don't have Swipe, and if they do, it's one of these 2 cards.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to note there is, if we imagine the absolute worst case scenario that our opponent could throw at us and we play around it, then whatever else we put on the board, whatever we're doing this turn, is likely to just be completely ironclad, right? If the only thing that answers us is Swipe and we play around it, then we're already going to have a board that can't be dealt with anyway. So I like that way of thinking, of just think of the worst case scenario, plan around that, and pretty much whatever your plans are will be successful, because nothing can clear the board, or nothing can do that successfully. And you also using that to inform future decisions, right? Where we know that our opponent doesn't have swipe, or we strongly, strongly suspect that they don't, or some other form of board clear. And we start abusing that fact by putting down a whole bunch of 1 HP minions and just saying, look, you told me you didn't have swipe when I had, you know, a board that was very swipeable. Now that I know you don't have swipe, now I'm just going to flood because I've already picked that up off of your play. So obviously,
Yeah.
again, something that robots can't do with this deck, something that as a human player to be more successful, we absolutely can do. Playing around those threats or employing tools like thinking of the worst case scenario.
Yeah. Something that Zoo does really well is punishing opponents with bad hands. Because Zoo is very consistent. You run a ton of 1-drops, and you likely will be playing a ton of minions every turn. And it's hard to have a bad hand with Zoo. Where if your opponent doesn't have the cards they need to deal with your deck, and you correctly read that, then you could play super aggressive in their face, and they can't do anything, and you know that.
Right, just closing out a game quickly. You know, it always feels kind of nice just to know, okay, if they have proven already that they don't have answers to my things, I can just, you know, I can punish that because my deck will always be more consistent. Whatever I get off the top of my deck will be playable pretty much every single turn, whereas they have a sequence of cards that they would need to even stay in the game. So I agree with what you're saying there. Even Rogue decks that counter this pretty hard can run into that same issue as well. Speaking of which, I know that we've taken quite a bit of time here, but this is a very informative session. Maybe before we play some games, we can talk about some of these matchups that Zoo has. So let's start with whichever one you'd like. We got the 2 S tier decks. That's always the question. We've got Rogue and Druid. Which one do you want to go over first?
Well, let's go with Rogue, the arguable best deck in the game.
So what's our game plan playing against Rogue, and why is this kind of maybe not such a good matchup for us?
So it's not our game plan is the same as most of the time. It's you establish a strong control of the board, and then you never let them get anything down, and then you just kill them before they can even do anything. Right? It feels really suffocating to play against the Zoo sometimes, because they've got so many minions, you can't put down a minion of your own, and you don't have a great way of clearing that. But Rogue does have a bunch of good cards that does clear your board, and those cards are, you know, Backstab. A lot of your minions line up very well into Backstab. SI Agent, that 2 damage breakpoint again, but this time they're developing a 3/3. Fan of Knives, 1 damage, but they can buff that to 2 damage. But even 1 damage is still good against a lot of our minions. And then Blade Flurry even. They can buff that with the Deadly Poison. I don't think your board really survives 3 damage without you buffing it yourself. And those are just killer cards for you to be playing against. And then if you're life tapping, they've got those finishers, and they can kill you from 20 HP, and it just, no matter what you do, it feels dangerous if they have the answers. And if they don't have the answers, then you just run them over. But if they have the cards, it feels pretty dangerous to play against the Rogue.
Yeah, it does feel like it's a bit of a binary matchup, and it feels like as the Zoolock, there's not always that much we can do against a Rogue player. There are some cards like Soulfire that maybe are beneficial to keep in the mulligan just so we can handle SI or Earthen Ring and try and extend a board advantage, kill them as quickly as possible. Maybe use it as burn damage, but highly doubtful. But yeah, a lot of times it's more about whether the Rogue has the perfect answers to us than it is about exactly how we build our board. And for the record, that's really not much different than how Rogue approaches any other matchup. It's a very reactionary deck that it has all the answers to every single deck in the game. They just have to draw them in the right order. And again, Zoo, that's really no different.
Yeah, typically a Zoo versus Rogue, you're winning until you're not, and then you've lost.
Yeah, and then you have a bunch of whelps filling up your board.
That's true. Sometimes even 6 of them at once. You think that would be good for Zoo, but it's not.
You just got to play the dart wolf on the next turn. So Rogue, obviously not the most favored matchup. What about Druid?
Right, so Druid's the second best deck, I would say. and you actually do beat Druid. Now there's a caveat there where part of what makes Druid really strong is, of course, all the mana cheat and the great cards that they run. But another reason is because Druid can high roll in every matchup. They can hit that wild growth, and now they're ahead in mana for the rest of the game. They can innervate out a big minion that their opponent can't deal with. And then there's just so many ways Druid can get lucky and beat you. So although you do beat Druid, Druid can just get lucky and then you lose. Early Keeper of the Grove can often do a 3-for-1, sometimes even 4-for-1. And then you just can't really do anything against that. And your whole early game plan is stifled.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Druid can high roll against you. And that sort of limits how strong this matchup is for you. But you do beat Druid typically because if they don't get lucky, you have ways to trade well into their minions, even though they're bigger than yours. Because you trade so well, you can just kill those off, continue to go face, and they don't really have good ways to deal with your minions. They have Swipe, but Swipe is only 1 damage AoE, and I can easily buff my minions to be stronger than
and I think a couple of these buff cards in particular, Abusive Sergeant, very good at giving a 1 or maybe 2, but usually just a 1-mana minion, the ability to trade up favorably into something. We've already talked a little bit about using Abusive Sergeant on Knife Juggler to get it up to 5. The juggle hits the Druid of the Claw, and now we've invested 2 mana, really, in a 2-mana card to kill a 5-mana card, and also develop something on the board as well for very cheap for just 1 mana that turn. So we have a lot of these really good ways to trade up, whether it's with Dark Iron or Abusive, sometimes Defender of Argus, sometimes the Dire Wolf. We have a lot of ways to trade up. But we also have Doomguard, which is a tough card for Druid to deal with, I would say, in general. Removes that Ancient of Lore, and basically trades favorably with a 2-for-1 into any other card. What are we looking for? Oh, go ahead.
Druid doesn't really have single target removal options. So you play the Doomguard on 5, and that it's sort of like, I mean, they can't deal with that. And they can play their 7-cost minions, right? Die to Doomguard, or can't kill Doomguard. So it's pretty tough.
So what are we looking for in the mulligan against Druid?
So typically, I think a good mulligan strategy is to roll everything that doesn't cost 1 mana.
Mm-hmm.
So I like keeping Argent Squire. I like keeping Flame Imp. I like keeping Voidwalker. Those are the premier 1-drops.
Mm-hmm.
I'm fine with keeping the Leper Gnome, Priestess, Abusive Sergeant, especially if I have stuff that I know will line up into the Druid. But I also like to think that sort of like a weird concept I like having is that I have 1 floater spot in my hand. Because Druid is so consistent on those 1-drops, I can reliably pick those up in my draw. So I like to keep 1, or if I have a good card in my hand, like Doomguard, I like to say that I have 1 spot for Doomguard against Druid, or even Defender of Argus. And I can sort of hold those. I know my early game will be fine. And then I just know I guarantee have that Doomguard on 5, or that Argus on 4.
Mm-hmm. Are there ever any situations in which you would keep Soulfire in your opening hand just to deal with that real nut start from Druid where they innervate the Keeper?
Or the Keeper. Yeah, so Soulfire is another card that occupies that floater spot, where I wouldn't keep Doomguard and a Soulfire, but if I have Soulfire, I can keep that. And that lets they cheat out the early Keeper, and then joke's on them, I kill the Keeper, Soulfire, and I still develop my cards.
Right. Yeah, I would say, any deck, whether you're playing Hunter and you keep Freezing Trap against Druid even when you're favored, or this with Soulfire, there's always the possibility that they innervate out something absolutely gigantic. Could be on the first turn with the coin, could be on the second turn. That's something that really disrupts our game plan a lot. And certainly Keeper, when we're playing an aggro deck, Keeper is the number 1 threat. Just 4 HP to attack, deals 2 when it comes into play, pretty much cuts off a lot of our trade-up options that we have. So Keeper would certainly be the number 1. So keeping some answers just in case Druid ramps. It can sometimes be good, even if we weren't planning to use Soulfire anyway. It's okay that we have one card in our hand that's sort of dead right now. The risk of losing that matchup that we should be favored in, that we want to be gaining elo every time we play against a Druid, I would say the risk of that justifies us keeping Soulfire or Doomguard sometimes in our opener. Okay, so we've talked about Druid, we've talked about Rogue. Let's talk a little bit about some of these slower decks. You promised that we'd talk about Control Warrior. What are your thoughts on the Control Warrior versus Zoo matchup?
Warrior versus Zoo matchup. So for that matchup, I think it's a little bit interesting because I think there is a lot of. I think Control Warrior is a deceptively difficult deck to play because you got to be efficient with those removals. And a lot of players who play Control Warrior to sort of beat the Zoo bots or to sort of climb that way don't really know the Control Warrior versus Zoo matchup. The bots aren't very good, so they can sort of get away with it. But when you're playing Control Warrior that isn't super teched for Zoo, I think and they're not super great at Control Warrior, I think the match is actually pretty even. And I'm not too worried about playing Control Warrior if I know they don't have a billion answers for Zoo. Like they're not running like double cleave and like 2 abominations for who knows what reason. Then I'm not too worried playing against the Warrior.
So what are we looking for in the Warrior matchup? Are we still completely focused on mulliganing everything that isn't one? Do we want to keep Soulfire in case of Armorsmith? What are we looking for in our mulligan?
I mean, I think it's pretty similar to what you're doing before. You want to keep your 1-drops. The premier 1-drops are always going to be the same. And the other 1-drops are very good as well because they synergize with each other and control the board. And then you've got that 1 floater spot for a Doomguard or something to sort of play later, and you're not worried about the consistency because your deck is super consistent. I mean, I don't really think there's necessarily anything else to do in the mulligan as you really. Like you're not running tech cards for specific matchups. You're just running good cards and you want to draw your good cards.
Right. And also just, there's a distinction too I'd like to make between seeing an opening hand that's like without the coin, for example, that's 1-drop into 2-drop into 3-drop. Normally that seems pretty good for decks, but when we're playing aggro decks, sometimes, I would say maybe more often than not, our best opening hand is actually 1-drop into double 1-drop. So Flame Imp Voidwalker, Argent Squire, or having Abusive in there to help us trade up, or a Young Priestess to help buff some of those minions that we put on the board. I find a lot of times that turn 2, if we can spread, get 3 minions on the board, or if we're playing with the coin, we can coin out 2 1-drops, play 2 more 1-drops. That tends to be a little bit more powerful start than just reliably placing 1 minion down on curve. Do you find that same thing when you're playing Zoo?
Yeah, I think just having, I mean, a board that is sticky and a board that trades favorably. If you have 2 minions instead of 3, then that can sometimes be a little bit easier to clear as the Warrior. My Fiery War Axe goes right into your Amani Berserker, and maybe I wish I had 2 1-drops for the Fiery War Axe to sort of have to pick between. But I mean, you do run the risk of if you spread yourself too thin and you didn't get those buffs on yet, then a card like Whirlwind comes down, and maybe they even have a Armorsmith or Acolyte of Pain, and now your board is being cleared, and they're getting extra value of that, and that just feels terrible.
Yeah, and again, it kind of comes back to playing around the opponent's threats, right? Is on turn 1, we would prefer not to play or turns 1 and 2, we'd prefer not to play only things with 1 HP. We want to make as much diversity, whether it's by having Argent Squire with the shield, Flame Imp with the 2 extra health, or Young Priestess to buff us up, or Voidwalker with lots of HP.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, we do want some of these cheap, crappy minions like Leper Gnome to trade up into stuff, but we also do want to make sure that whatever minions we have will connect face if our opponent just plays like Whirlwind or just one type of removal spell.
Yeah, so something else that matters a little bit against Warrior is to take note of what cards they toss in the mulligan. And if they're full rolling, then you know they don't have any, that likely they just got 4 random cards and they don't have anything good. And then you could play a little bit more risky and a little bit more aggressively to try to win if a good player is piloting Control Warrior, that's a pretty terrible matchup. So you can sort of see in the mulligan the strength of their early game hand. And if they're keeping everything, then be worried about what they're about to do. But if they're full tossing or tossing most of their cards, then they've got 4 random cards, and I mean, you might be fine.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for the folks out there who maybe play on mobile or something, it can be a little bit more difficult to tell. If you use the Hearthstone deck tracker from hsreplay.net or whatever the name of the site is, if you use that deck tracker, it can tell you which cards your opponent's kept in the mulligan and which ones they've discarded. So you can kind of even build a picture there of what's the strength of my opponent's hand that I'm anticipating. And if we see a bunch of M's, then we think, well, you're not going to have Fiery War Axe, Armorsmith, Acolyte, Taskmaster, and Whirlwind in there, right?
Yeah, something I find funny is Zoo's pretty. The mulligan's fairly straightforward. You sort of can figure out what you need. And if you do your mulligan really fast, then you can spend the rest of the time watching your opponent and seeing what they're playing out and what they're tossing. And that way, I'm playing on my phone, I can see what they're tossing.
Yeah, yeah. It's not impossible to do it without a deck tracker. It certainly helps, especially on desktop.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, not impossible. It's always good to just take a peek as soon as you've chosen your mulligan cards. Wait for your opponent to choose theirs and see how many cards were returned that they discarded out of that opening hand. A couple other control decks. Is our game plan much different when we're talking about like Priest, mid-range Shaman, control Paladin? Are we approaching those more or less the same way that we would control Warrior, or are those a little bit different?
I mean, I think Priest is a pretty hard matchup. They've got a combo that does 4 damage AoE, and I think it's almost impossible to buff your minions to a 4 HP breakpoint. So I like to think that the Priest matchup's pretty losing if they draw that. They've also got the Holy Nova, and that they can trade their minions and then finish off ours that they couldn't kill, and then heal theirs right back up. And it's almost impossible to play around that as the Zoo. So you're probably losing that. Mid Shaman's a little bit different because I actually think that Zoo does really well into mid, because Shaman plays pretty slow, especially if they don't have Argent Squire. Then they're maybe like tapping turn 2, and that's a 0/2 totem that we can kill, or even just choose not to kill. Just go face. They're taking extra damage. They don't run heal. They might run Sen'jin. I don't see many people that run Sen'jin. They've got the wolves, but the wolves go right into your damage breakpoints again. And you just sort of roll over Shaman unless they draw lightning. But even if they draw it, sometimes you can buff your creatures out of range, and you're not even worried about Lightning Storm. And then they need like 2 Lightning Storms or like Pyromancer and interesting deck decisions. So
yeah, and even when they have Lightning Storm, part of what we can do with this deck is we can sort of read our opponent's hand and think, are they baiting me? And if we feel like they are baiting us with Lightning Storm, we can just be tapping. Number one. And number two is a lot of decks after they clear the board, they'd like to have a follow-up that turn. Shaman may not have that possibility. But even if they clear their board and are hoping to follow up with something strong next turn, something good and proactive, Shaman doesn't have that as much because they're overloading with their AoE, right? So
yeah,
if they play Lightning Storm on 3 to deal with a board that's getting out of control that might have a young Priestess or something, we know that the next turn they're not really going to have a follow-up. We can reload on the board, and we can tap a couple extra times as the game goes on to make up for the 3-for-1 or whatever they got off their Lightning Storm.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of these early game board removal, that's all they're going to be playing, and then you just restock up your minion.
Yeah.
It's almost as if they didn't use it.
Yeah.
But in the case of Shaman, then they can't restock. They can't even contest the next turn. So it ends up being really bad for them sometimes.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's a very frustrating matchup for mid-range Shaman. It's typically a value-oriented deck, but more oriented around getting value against Druid or other classes that play one big clunky thing every turn that you can just hex and do your own thing as the Shaman. It has efficient ways to deal with Divine Shields and Death Rattles, things like that a lot of decks don't. And we're not really doing those, right? There's only one good card against Zoo in the whole deck for Shaman, that's Lightning Storm. So it doesn't really line up too well. Okay, I want to move on to talking maybe a little bit more about fast decks. Now, we've already sort of covered this Zoo versus Zoo matchup. That's the other list that we were looking at previously. What about burn decks that have lots of chargers?
Yeah, so typically those burn decks do require them to chip away a little bit. I like to say 15 damage is when you're just in kill range. So you put someone down to 15, and then you burn them from hand. Now, if Zoo controls the board the entire game, it's really hard for them to get that to chip you down to those breakpoints.
Yeah, absolutely. I've experienced this many times firsthand. Because of cards like Voidwalker, I would say Voidwalker is a real standout in the aggro versus aggro matchup because it's got 1 attack, it's enough to pop bubbles, and it's got 3 HP, so it trades favorably into Leper Gnome, Abusive Sergeant, many of the things that other classes will be playing on turn 1. And Flame Imp, similarly, it's got 2 HP, which means that it not only can it trade up into something with its 3 attack, but because of the 2 HP, it can be used to value trade with a 1/1 or something else that's on the board like that. And Young Priestess as well. This is a card that's very difficult for aggro decks. If they let Priestess live for 1 turn or 2 turns, it can create so much value that you just run away with the game as soup. Whereas other decks don't really have a good way to buff HP of minions. Aggro versus aggro is all about the value trades, and buffing that HP is exactly what enables that sort of favorable value trade from our perspective. And I completely agree with what you said as well, that a lot of times burn decks, they're trying to do damage through the board for a little bit. They play out cards like Argent Squire that are tough to deal with, that can just swing face for a little bit. And once our opponent finally cleans up all the Squires and Leper Gnomes and Abusives and stuff, then decks like Aggro Rogue will typically finish with something like Arcane Golem. That's something that we just kind of disallow them from doing. They don't get any chip damage on in the early game, and then they have a handful of chargers and opponent's face that's got 20 HP that they can't deal with. Okay, so that was a lot of information, Amber. I appreciate you sticking with us so far. Do you feel like you got some time to take maybe 1 or 2 of these lists out for a spin?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, cool.
I think I need to open up Hearthstone though.
That's usually a good start.
I mean, there's a price to opening this game.
Yeah, check out the shop and you can put an exact number on that price.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you while we're getting into the game, is there, if you were to give the best piece of general advice that you could to aspiring Zoolock players out there, what's the advice that you'd give them?
Sort of like the general advice is that there's 2 things that you should be thinking of at every point in time, which is what's the most likely thing my opponent will play next turn, and what's the worst possible thing my opponent can play next turn. So I want to play around my opponent's the best option that my opponent has to deal with my board, but they might not always have it. So I also want to think of what are they likely going to do, and I want to play around a course of action that plays around sort of the range of my opponent's options, but balanced towards what you expect them to play, right? So if I think swipe is really good for them here, but I mean, they might not have swipe, and do I want to compromise my position on the game to play around? Well, that's something I have to decide.
Really wise words there. I think that there's an immense amount of complexity that goes into anticipating our opponent's plays, deciding if we actually want to play around them. For example, early on in the game, if we suspect that our board will be weak to swipe, sometimes we just take that chance, right? We just put our stuff down, we let them clear us on 4, and we just accept that that's a possible outcome. All right, so which list, we covered 3 different lists today. Which list are we working with right now?
This is the standard, stock standard Z list.
Okay.
And so I like to keep 1 mana creatures, so I'm going to toss these other 2 away. And now I've got Voidlord, or Voidwalker, some good things to put here. So I know on if when I end my turn, my opponent will have 2 mana, and the hero power might come down to kill, let's say, a Young Priestess. I do want to play Young Priestess, but I want to put it with something that protects it, because I don't want my opponent to kill it. I think typically as Zoo, you have the coin. Playing 2 creatures is sort of what you want to be doing.
Yeah, this is something we talked about a little bit earlier. This concept of starting off with, instead of curving out 1, 2, 3, we instead go for 1+1 and then another 1+1 turn, where we develop so many minions at the front that it's hard for our opponents to play any sort of single target removal to deal with this.
Right. And then for this turn, I know my opponent's in the mulligan. My opponent has 2 cards left, and they both were tossed. So even though by playing Argent Squire and the Leper Gnome, that is perfect setup for swipe, or will likely be a really good setup for swipe, I'm not too worried about that because I'm gonna bet that they don't have it.
So we probably wish that the Leper Gnome had gotten buffed there, just to be a perfect counter to swipe.
Yeah,
There comes
they
the
top
swipe.
deck swipe. And so now my board is a little bit punished. And they did top deck that, so it's a little bit, you can't really play around that.
Mm-hmm.
But they spent 4 mana doing that, and they didn't develop anything. So now I get to play my own minions, and it's as if the swipe never happened.
Now I noticed you didn't send Soulfire there, like all of the good robots that we've seen on the server. Why did you choose to keep this?
Well, by holding the Soulfire, I have just clearly punished this Azure Drake. Now this Azure Drake is instantly dead. And those breakpoints there on the 5 mana turn, it could be Druid of the Claw, Azure Drake are things that they will likely be playing. And 4 mana plus this Abusive kills the Druid of the Claw. 4 mana straight up kills the Azure Drake. And sort of I'm just playing around what my opponent likely will be playing on 5. And I just don't think Soulfire Face is generally good as just a random play midway through the game, right? You want to be doing something that sort of does nothing.
And there are literally only 2 we've gone through. At that point, we'll have 22 cards in the deck. There's a 1 in 11 chance we could have drawn Doomguard, which is the only punish for keeping Soulfire there. And I would say we most of the time want to take 10 out of 11 chances rather than play around the 1 in 11.
Yep. So Son actually messaged me through the game and said, just checking if still Zubot. By the way, when I matched against you, I was sure you were a bot.
I'm still not convinced you're not, but
Right. So here, for the 7 mana turn, the big guy is what I'm worried about. But I mean, typically Druid runs that as a one-off. I don't think you might have it, but I'm also looking. I think my board's pretty strong. I don't know if they could really kill my board. So maybe I want to go for a all damage face, and maybe this Chillwind Yeti can't, and whatever they're playing can't deal anything here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is one of those things that we talked about a little bit earlier of when you flip that switch and decide, now is the time I go face, that I don't value trade. It seems like in this situation, we're losing 5 attack and 5 HP if we trade into the Yeti. That just mathematically doesn't seem like a particularly good choice for us, so I like your decision here to just go face, ignore that this is kind of an awkward minion to deal with.
They interestingly used so Force of Nature was pseudo board clear there, and that's 6 mana that they didn't use to develop anything. They just used as board clear.
Mm-hmm.
So then again, I get to spend my turn to develop my own board again.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I want to do here is I could go face with this, and that puts them in range of a few things. But I think trading is not bad here either.
It's a tough decision, really. At 8 HP, we're much more likely to pull that trigger, but you're not looking at Doomguard
But they
or
do
Soulfire.
They do run taunts too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, they had the swipe, which was unfortunate.
Mm-hmm.
But see, if I went face there, they would still have the Yeti, and I can't kill them from 5 HP through this taunt that they just developed.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Ooh, hello.
So I like playing this. This clears cleanly. I do lose 2 cards that I do like those cards, but I'm okay sacrificing those for the Guard of the Doom.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty reasonable play. Oh, and not even taunting here, so...
Yeah, I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, I do too. There's not a ton of 1 damage sources that you have. I suppose there's one.
This is a really strong really strong Earthen Ring.
Yeah, where's your BGH?
It's unfortunate that he has the Azure Drake because this lets him kill with Wrath, yeah. But
Yeah.
also they drew a card, and one of the strengths of the Zoo is always having cards because I'll have 2 cards to play next turn, and I mean he would be starting to run out of cards. Now I'm also a little bit worried on my HP is getting lower. He managed to effectively deal with all my cards with Force of Nature and Swipe, and sort of looking a bit grim.
Yeah, double swipe is always something that's unfortunate to run into. It's, you know, we've seen 15 cards from the Druid. I don't need to do the math to know that that's not really the Druid's, that's not the most statistically likely outcome to have 2 swipes in the top 20 cards. Is 20, yeah, I guess it was top 25 actually. So they got the first one off top deck on 4.
Yeah, another thing to note is they did get Wild Growth, and there's some debate whether you want to Shapeshift or Wild Growth on those early turns. But yeah, they did get the Wild Growth, and them being able to play Swipe off the top of the deck really helped them out there. Where, I mean, now the game's already lost, so I will just play everything. But yeah, the Wild Growth, surviving well with the Wild Growth played, is allowing this really strong endgame of Rag being played and all their strong features.
Right, exactly. And it's, you know, one of the reasons that we know that Druid is one of the top 2 S tier decks in Hearthstone. Is because they have that kind of high rolling potential where hitting Wild Growth, being able to swipe a turn early, you know, you're playing around somebody who hasn't kept swipe maybe in their opening hand. You think, you know, it's a reasonable risk to take, and sometimes we get punished for that, but 2 times out of 3 you probably aren't going to be punished for that. So
exactly,
I would take that. I would take that risk and win 66% of my games if I had the choice. We had a question in the chat here while we're moving into the next one. So, is there a distinction being made between the climb to and playing at Legend when we're talking about some of these deck building choices? Or is this basically the climb is easy, we're talking about at Legend play?
I mean, I think your game plan for a deck like Zoo doesn't really change much depending on where you are in the. I think what matters on the climb is, or just wherever you are in the ladder, it's just what are you playing against? And you can play against all sorts of decks at all sorts of parts of the ladder, where sometimes I'll play Days and whatever Legend rank I'm sitting at, and I'll play against a ton of Zoo. And some days I won't. I'll play against only Rogue. And that sort of things like that happen, and you just gotta, on the climb, that can happen too, and you just play against the decks that you're seeing. And Zoo's not, as I mentioned before, Zoo's sort of a concept and not a deck list, and you can just sort of put whatever you want in based on what you're seeing. So if I'm seeing a lot of a Zoo, then I put in a couple archers, put in a coil, and just call it a day and farm the Zoos. And if I'm not playing against those, then I adjust accordingly.
That's a really good answer, and something that sometimes players are a little bit reticent to do is to play a couple variations of the same deck where you have essentially, you know, maybe 25-ish, 25, 27 cards that remain the same. But make those micro adjustments on the climb. That's valuable advice. You don't have to go in and edit your deck every time. You can just save a couple of versions of the deck and feel like you can just switch it up easily to better handle the meta that you're in.
So a bit unfortunate that we didn't have 2 1-drops to play, but we can do that now.
And is there ever a consideration there about playing maybe Shattered Sun to buff the Argent Squire, or do we want to get as much damage on the board as possible?
I just want to. I think just playing the minions is better. They've got 3 mana. There's not much they can do on 3 mana. If I buff the Argent Squire, then I'm not really. I want something to play on 3. I guess I could play the Dire Wolf and the Leper Gnome, but that's stats that I'm losing out on. Right, I want to put those down now, and then I can decide if what I want to buff after seeing the reaction of my opponent.
Right, and the Leper Gnome is the thing we want to trade into our opponent's stuff. You know, the Argent Squire to some extent as well, but the Leper Gnome really is the one that we'd like to do that with.
Right. So now that I didn't buff too early, I have a couple options, right? I could even just buff the Leper Gnome to trade well into this, or I could just Soulfire it. I think no matter what you do is you do want to play the Sun Cleric, but I do think the Soulfire here is just too clean into the Drake.
Absolutely, and nice discard. We actually were probably fine with either one of those because, yes, we can play the Defender of Argus next turn, that's really strong, but also the Doomguard coming down on 5. It's not something that Druid can readily deal with. They don't have Execute or Shield Slam or any of those things that could really easily and cleanly deal with it without losing too much tempo. So looking at a pretty strong board here, we do manage to dodge swipe. We keep up 1 minion here, probably the Shattered Sun, which is good. Always building a sticky board.
Alright, he played Wrath, which kills my Direwolf, but I'm not too worried about that because for the most part my board is still pretty intact. And this is, again, one of these sucky hands where you have Doomguard and Soulfire in them.
Yeah.
I think you always want to play the Flame Imp. You just want to get the creature on the board. And then on 5, maybe I'll discard the Soulfire. And that's unfortunate, but it's a necessary play, maybe.
Oh, shit.
All right, so this is a terrible situation. But, I mean... I guess I have the luxury of Soulfiring here, knowing that I have a second Doomguard I'm okay with losing.
Yeah.
But then the question is, where am I sending this Soulfire? And I think you just send it face, because I can trade cleanly into this guy. You could make the argument Doomguard into the... and the Argent into the Druid of the Claw. But then my worry there is the Doomguard falls within swipe range, falls within Wrath range, and I don't really want it to fall within those breakpoints.
All right, nice clean trade here. I like this. Still within Wrath range, but we've got a couple other minions on the board here, so even if Wrath, the only other thing that we're really looking at is Druid of the Claw with that. Okay, so I really like how you kept Abusive here, trying to get the maximum amount of value out of that as well.
Yeah, so we're running the risk now of we use a Soulfire in the early game, and then we had the Soulfire Doomguard hand, which is rarely a problem, but we had everything. So now all of our best cards, Doomguard and Soulfire, they're all used up. So that ends up being a risk in this game.
Yeah, and that's pretty much all our burn damage, but at the same time, we've seen a Sunwalker, a Druid of the Claw, and Ancient of War. Now in the top 11 cards of our opponent's deck, it's not super likely that we're going to see too many more taunts come out. They do play a fair number of taunts, but at some point they have to run out, right?
Yeah. I want to keep something on the board. I want to keep the Voidwalker on the board just to eat up that 5 damage. But I traded the Doomguard in because I think that 3 damage breakpoint's a little bit risky. I don't want to leave that to just get killed off by spell.
Right.
So it turns out this person runs 2 Sunwalkers, which is quite unfortunate for us because we've lost the Doomguard to discard fodder, and this is not an easy card to get through.
Yeah.
Now he's hitting 9, he's going to get the 14 damage, but I really don't have much luxury to not tap, because if he has it, then I mean, the combo, then I'm going to lose any.
Right, exactly. Yeah. We just pretend like they don't have combo here. Again, if they do, of course we lose. So we've still got the setup to kill this next turn. I'm not 100%. We're not 100% sure on this the deck building decision here, but it's possible that this is Control Druid as well, playing 2 Sunwalkers. Or that it could just be a standard combo Druid that doesn't play Sylvanas or Karen, just puts Sunwalker in there instead, and hopes that they don't get matched into a Druid.
Yeah, I'm typically not a fan of Sunwalker in general, but against Zoo it seems to be doing really well, so... All right, he's going to play everything. He might have Savage Roar just on its own. If he does have that, then that's not really much we can do.
Right, we're taking 9 plus 6, so we're taking 15 already from a roar.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it still worthwhile to tap here, given that, let's see, with 9 on the board...
Yeah, that's the calculation.
Well, we could get swiped, and that kills us. Roar kills us no matter what, so really I think it's the choice of do they have swipe or not swipe.
Yeah, I think you tap anyways here. And then I got to play this Harvest Golem. And then maybe this Death Rattle is a little bit difficult. Something that you do want to be worried about while having this Dark Iron Dwarf on the board is that they could trade the Sylvanas into it, and then they can kill their own Sylvanas. And there's many ways to do that. And that sometimes is a situation you don't want to be in, where they're taking your sticky Harvest Golem with the Sylvanas.
Right.
Okay, so they drew this off the top.
Yep.
My opponents are very good top deckers, but so are Zoobots. And I'm sure you guys have felt that on the last.
Seems like some of those bots work for Blizzard from what I've seen.
Yeah, and part of the reason why it feels like Zoobots just always draw the best card possible is because Zoo is such a consistent deck where there's a lot of options that like work out for the Zoo. And also the Zoo is drawing more than one card, where you might not draw your great cards because you didn't life tap 3-4 times this game, where Zoo did.
Yeah. Yeah, it's nice not having to include card draw cards in the deck, just being able to use that hero power instead. I think, like you'd mentioned earlier, potentially the strongest hero power in the game, at least in Classic. Demon Hunter's got a pretty good hero power as well, but at the very least in Classic, just being able to draw a card that's going to outvalue a totem, it's going to outvalue a Silverhand Recruit or whatever it is. Also matches up pretty well with Warrior and some of these other slower decks where you don't really care if they're armoring up, you're getting card advantage the whole time.
The light protects me.
So how would you evaluate this hand? Do you feel like this is a pretty strong start against Warrior here?
I mean, Warrior is not a great matchup. I have the luxury of playing against this player, and I know that he plays Druid with Mind Control Tech. Now, I can assume that there's a possibility that he runs Mind Control Tech and Warrior, and now I have another level of just wacky things I have to consider. Do I want to go too wide that I don't know, Mind Control Tech comes into play? So I do want to play this Leper Gnome. And then I think this Armswift really does need to die.
I think so too.
I think Soulfire is the way to go to kill that. We could either one of we still have a 3-drop played to go on 3, so I'm not too worried about that. I think Harvest Golden's the better one. So it's okay that we lost the Shattered Sun Cleric. So we're still good for future turns.
Yeah, Harvest Golem definitely one of those creatures that can really start to swing this in favor of Zoo as well, just by the merit of it's not easy to clear. It's going to essentially 2-for-1 just about anything that the Warrior can do.
Yeah. So I'm getting a little bit low on cards, so I can consider tap Argent Squire. I also think that I need to kill this Acolyte of Pain because I don't want him to draw 2 cards. I'm kind of okay with him drawing 1 card because that's the best I can do. And I want to draw my cards too. Get some better cards. And I'll just play 1 Argent Squire. And I'm putting a sort of bookend here. That way, if I do draw the Direwolf Alpha, I can go.
Really, really, really good point here as well. Yeah, notice for our viewers out there, we notice the bubbles go on the ends. We can put Harvest Column somewhere on the end here too, depending on what happens. Maybe we trade the bubble off one. And what do you know? Rewarded right away for that.
I want to play that, and then the question is, if I put this Leper Gnome into the Cruel Taskmaster, I am overkilling it by 1 damage, but I think that's okay because that 1 damage will then go on to Argent Squire on the right of it, and I didn't really lose out on that. And then I do get the Death Rattle, the Leper Gnome. But I think having, even if the Direwolf wouldn't give that bonus damage to the Squire, I think it's better to have stickier minions on than have that Leper Gnome, even though I'm overkilling, right? I want to keep my bubbles.
Hmm.
Okay, he has Brawl, which this is kind of a sucky Brawl. Like, you don't really want to Brawl, you know, these kind of minions, but
Right,
it is what
exactly.
it is.
Yeah, typically Warrior would want to have either something on the board or wait until maybe turn 7 to play an Armor Smith with it to sort of guarantee that they can get a little bit more value.
Here it's sort of, the positioning is a little bit weird. Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I think I know where you're going with this positioning, but explain it to us.
The positioning that I want to get both of these. I wanted my Harvest Golem and my Argent Squire to eat up the buffs, and I want them both to get taunt. And there's different ways to position it, but I don't think it really matters as long as they're both getting the buff and the taunt. And I've already used the Direwolf. I'm no longer too concerned about that.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, do we want to tap here, or is this a young Priestess turn?
So he's already used the Brawl. I think Priestess is a stronger play here, because I mean, he's going to kill this Harvest Golem, maybe, right? Maybe he can't even get out of range. And that's a high roll that we kind of want to see. But even if he does kill this Harvest Golem, then my other minions are getting a little bit harder to kill.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really think that we need a trade either. Okay, so we didn't get the buff on the Harvest Golem, but I don't think we're too worried about cards. Even that one card, we're going to be drawing 2 per turn.
Right.
Okay, this cleave is unlucky for us.
Well, it doesn't
Not
seem
not
like
every
the best
warrior runs
play.
cleave.
Yeah, I would think that normally, as the warrior there, we'd want to pop the Harvest Golem first.
Yeah, I would say so too.
It's just 2 wasted damage.
Yeah, and he's also used 2 shield slams and an execute. So this guy is using like 50 different cards here.
Right.
And that's actually a really weak turn for a warrior. To be using cleave, shield slam, and execute all in one turn, and for me to still have cards left over, this feels like you did something wrong. Because I'm going to bump this damage golem into the Black Knight. That's obvious, he can see that too. But from what we can see, we know that we're going to be buffing our young Priestess. The Priestess, another buff for the Sun Cleric. And we're all really happy with that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe he has that, there's a 0 cost card that does 1 damage. I don't think he has it, but maybe he kills off my Priestess here. But we're still fine with that, because we can still buff whatever we draw with the Sun Cleric,
Mm-hmm.
and we're still trading favorably into the Black. Unless he's got 2 of those cards, which he does not.
So we're in a pretty good spot here, I would think. Getting to play out the Juggler, getting a little free damage, and Warrior's one of those decks that they really want to keep as many resources in hand as possible. Use the hero power to sort of accumulate those, not necessarily try and swing the board every single turn. And this is the exact reason why, right? They play 2 shield slams, an execute, and a cleave in the same turn. And now they basically don't have any way to deal with your board in perpetuity, right? Other than maybe a second brawl, but even then.
So this comes back a little bit to what I was saying earlier, where I sort of bad warriors or warrior players who aren't as great. I think it's actually fairly even matchup, even though that seems a little bit weird to say. I'm not too worried playing into warriors that sort of spend their removal cards frivolously.
I think I would agree with you there. It's a deck that maybe doesn't receive quite as much attention for the skill cap that it actually requires to play it effectively. You can make deck building choices that, put in Abomination or whatever else that just beat, a Zoobot, but are otherwise not going to be particularly effective against a human opponent, like you're saying. You're reasoning through a lot of these choices, saying, okay, if they have Brawl, then this. If they have this, then that. And, as a result of that, you're the one that's got all the cards, right? They've got 1 card left in their hand, and they're not going to be able to draw anymore. So I was going to ask if this is the part where we start going face, but I think you just answered that question for me.
Yeah, so he does have, if he has 5 damage in his hand, right? Which he might. This could be a Goral Hell, and in which case, then he will beat me.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's going to be hard for him to get through my board, and hard for him to get out of just any range for me to kill. So he's going to do a couple trades here. Wow, and he has a second cleave. He's a double cleave gamer, and he actually hits really perfectly. And now he's 1 damage out of my range. But I mean, this is the classic Zoo fashion. You top deck the card that you need.
It's a lot easier to top deck the card that wins for you
Yeah.
when you have 2 chances at it too.
Yeah,
It?
and I like to BM and I like to play all my stuff. So
Cool.
and then I play everything.
Yeah, to each their own, right?
Yeah, if I have weapons, I like just attacking the Alexstrasza and then.
It's all about that psychological game, setting somebody up to just have a plain old shitty,
I might
frustrating
play
day.
against him. I might play against him later. You never know, right?
Exactly.
So if he is a little bit off his game, then the next time I play him, he's like, "Oh, the Zoobot. I'm playing against the Zoobot again," and then he's sort of thrown off.
That's a cool mental game that you play. I like that.
Okay, so this is a matchup we didn't talk about, but this is the classic counter to Zoo. People will always tell you Freeze Mage just wrecks, and it does.
Yeah.
And there's nothing you can do about it. You Q Zoo into Freeze Mage, you're probably going to lose. So I like this hand. We've got 2 of my premier 1-drops. I'm going to use my sort of floater spot on this Harvest Golem here. Especially on a coin where I have 4 cards, and I sort of know that I've got my early turns covered. I could sort of just play whatever I want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the reason that Zoo tends to struggle a little bit more with Freeze Mage, rather than maybe other decks with a lot more chargers, is that primarily Zoo does damage with its board, and when the board is frozen, they don't have too many charge options.
The light protects.
So I know Zoo would typically want to coin out turn 1, but I want a coin to get Argus out.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I mean, you could take, you can sort of do a bunch of different. I like getting Argus out.
I like the Argus choice here as well. I feel like, it's the Harvest Golem. We don't need to buff it too much with Defender of Argus anyway. But Defender of Argus is giving. Right now all of our buffs are giving us essentially charge damage to the opponent's face, and really just racing the Freeze Mage down and popping the block is kind of the way that we win this matchup, right?
Exactly. So we're unfortunately in another position where we have the Doomguard and the Soul, and that's not too great.
Are you thinking maybe next turn, is there a possibility that we burn the Soulfire, hoping not to discard Doomguard?
Yeah, I like going for those flips, especially on losing matchups where you kind of want to go for some more risky plays to try to win it for you.
Mm-hmm.
That is very much a play that I will be going. And of course, we get punished for it, but that's okay.
That's fine. And yeah, I like the Harvest Golem choice here. Just building a board that has 2 death rattles on it, so they can't just clear and then ping to deal with it. Yeah.
I sort of want to race this player down, even though it's gonna be really hard because we know the board. There's the big one, the Blizzard. We know that's coming.
Yeah, Frost Nova.
You might not have it because he's looking to draw it with that death rattle there.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we might get a little fortunate here. So Frost Nova.
He also has the
maybe
other one on 7 as another option. Frost Nova definitely really ruins us, but
yeah, if we just get like 1 more turn of damage, we can pop the block though. We've got 4. Well, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, we got 4 in hand.
It's really hard for it to stop us. He needs to freeze the board, or we probably will be plopped because we have a lot of buffs on these Harvest Golems or whatever the Harvest Golems spawn out.
Mm-hmm.
And then it gets really hard for him without the block because then he's within range of these Soulfires that come down the Doomguard, and even if he's freezing, at that point it's not even that great for him.
Yeah. All right, cool. So we popped the block. I like what you're doing here. This is another important thing for folks at home to recognize. Pop the block at the least amount of HP possible. So attacking with the 5 attack minion there, then the 3 attack, not in the reverse order. It does matter the sequencing.
Yeah, so something that might happen here eventually is we're not going to be doing much. We're going to be tapping to look for the finishing Soulfire. But if he starts killing our minions, we do have a Knife Juggler that can go through freezes.
Mm-hmm. Was there ever a consideration to play the Priestess there to try and keep any minions alive?
I mean, you could do that, but I think the board is strong enough that we're not too worried about... Like, the Priestess isn't going to be doing much, because if he clears the board, we've got 2 minions spawning from the Harvest Golems. The Priestess is just going to add fodder, and it's probably... Whatever it's buffing is probably going to die anyways.
Right.
So he did not have the... He had 0 Blizzard, 0 Flame Strike, 0... 1 Frost Nova, but that came a bit late. We did win a very difficult matchup.
Yeah, that was really cool there. You know, nice to not have the all the free spells and everything as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well that was cool. So we got 4 games in there, kind of with 2 games against Druid, we got 1 against Warrior, 1 against Freeze Mage. So hopefully gives folks at home maybe some ideas about how to play this. I think always going back through the video and looking at those decisions and thinking, is this the same thing I would have done here? You know, you can pause at every turn and try and figure out, is this the same thing that Amber would have played? And if not, is there a good reason for not doing the same thing she did? That's one of the ways that I like to learn from watching strong players play as well.
Yeah, I definitely think that it's much more tight-knit community, but still everyone is actually fairly accessible. I know I have definitely gotten to at least the level of play that I play at now is a lot largely in part of reaching out to other players and spectating them play and asking them about the game and just hearing their thoughts. And that is definitely, I think, the biggest factor of my improvement in this game.
Yeah, and just, you know, for our viewers that have any lingering questions about Zoo or the community or just Hearthstone in general, how do people reach out to you?
You can just message me on Discord. You can ping me. You can direct message me too. I have my DMs open, but I have to manually accept DMs because it's not totally public. So, but I probably will, and you can just reach out to me anytime. I don't really mind.
Cool. And Discord is the best way to do that?
Yeah, I don't know where you'd find me anywhere else. I mean, if you somehow find my LinkedIn, you can message me there. Okay. But it's not under Ambi, and my last name's included, so you'll need to know that too.
A mystery that will remain a mystery to the universe, I think, for at least the next little bit. Yeah. So Amber, I want to say thanks again so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate you bringing all your insights on this deck and helping us understand not only how to build the deck, but also some of these really helpful tips about how to play the deck, how to play around certain things, what kind of general mentality we want to have, and also just giving us a couple of sample games here to check out and see how exactly you pilot the deck yourself. That's really valuable. So thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So, folks at home, I hope you learned something today from our Zoolock Spotlight. Once again, you're absolutely welcome to reach out to myself or Amber if you have any questions about this deck. You can find us in the Discord. That link is in the description to our channel. Otherwise, it's been great having you on. I think we're going to end the stream there. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.